The rolling hills of the Palouse are known for their quiet golden beauty, but in the early hours of November 13, 2022, they became the backdrop for a nightmare that would paralyze the nation. Moscow, Idaho, was a place where "lock your doors" was a suggestion, not a rule, a sanctuary for students who believed their biggest worries were midterms and football scores. That collective sense of safety didn't just break, it vanished into the freezing mountain air as 4 lives were snuffed out in a matter of minutes. Inside a 3-story rental home on King Road, a silent predator moved through the shadows with a precision that hinted at something far more calculated than a random act of rage. For 48 days, the killer was a ghost, leaving a community to suffocate under the weight of its own fear, while investigators sifted through a digital and biological puzzle that stretched across the entire country. The world watched as the name Brian Kohberger moved from an obscure PhD student to the face of modern American horror. It was a case that redefined the power of forensic genealogy and cellular tracking, revealing how the very technology we carry in our pockets can become the silent witness to our darkest deeds. But beyond the complex web of DNA and car sightings, there was the human cost. The vibrant futures of Kaylee, Madison, Zana, and Ethan, whose stories were nearly eclipsed by the sensationalism of the trial. In July 2025, after years of legal maneuvering and agonizing delays, the tension finally broke. A guilty plea echoed through the courtroom, stripping away the mystery and leaving only the cold, hard reality of 4 life sentences. It was the final somber chapter in a story of unfathomable cruelty, proving that even the most meticulously planned crimes eventually leave a trail that leads back to the light. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Madison Mogen, known to everyone simply as Maddie, was the personification of warmth. At 21 years old, she was a senior majoring in marketing, a field that perfectly suited her natural ability to connect with anyone she met. Maddie had a smile that felt like a secret she was letting you in on, and her loyalty to her friends was legendary. She was often seen with her lifelong best friend, Kaylee Goncalves. Their bond was so tight that they were frequently described as 2 halves of the same soul. They had grown up together in Coeur d'Alene, navigated the awkwardness of middle school, and celebrated the milestones of high school side by side. For Maddie, 1122. King Road wasn't just a rental, it was the final clubhouse before she and Kaylee moved on to the next chapter of their lives. She was hardworking, often pulling shifts at a local restaurant called Mad Greek, where her co-workers remembered her as the kind of person who could brighten the most stressful kitchen rush with a single joke. Kaylee Goncalves was the fire to Maddie's calm. Also 21, Kaylee was a senior majoring in general studies, and she was a force of nature. She was adventurous, outspoken, and fiercely protective of those she loved. By November 2022, Kaylee was already looking toward the horizon. She had a job lined up in IT in Texas and had recently purchased a new Range Rover, a symbol of the independence she had worked so hard to achieve. She was supposed to be moving out, but she had returned to Moscow that weekend to show off her new car and spend one last celebratory weekend with Maddie. There was a sense of completion in her life. She was ready to take on the world, but she couldn't resist the pull of one more night of laughter in the house that had come to define her college experience. On the floor below them lived Zana Kernodle, a 20-year-old junior majoring in marketing. Zana was the kind of person who radiated a gritty, authentic energy. She was known for her sharp wit and her refusal to conform to anyone else's expectations. Originally from Post Falls, Idaho, Zana was a hard worker who balanced her studies with a job at the same restaurant as Maddie. Her friends described her as the life of the party, but not in a loud or obnoxious way. She simply had a magnetic personality that drew people into her orbit. Zana had found something special in Moscow, a sense of belonging, and a deep, passionate love for Ethan Chapin. Ethan Chapin, a 20-year-old freshman from Conway, Washington, was the only victim who didn't officially live at 1122 King Road, but he was a constant, welcoming presence there. A member of the Sigma Chi fraternity, Ethan was a triplet, and his bond with his brother and sister, who also attended the University of Idaho, was the cornerstone of his life. Standing over 6 feet tall with a shock of curly hair, Ethan was often called a gentle giant. He had a laid-back, easygoing demeanor that balanced Zana's high-energy personality. On any given night, you could find Ethan at the house, usually in the kitchen or the living room, making sure everyone around him was having a good time. He was a talented athlete and a lover of the outdoors, but his true talent was making people feel seen and valued. Together, these four represented the vibrant heart of the university. Their social media feeds were a testament to their joy. Photos of them at the ARB, the campus arboretum, snapshots from football games where they wore the silver and gold of the Vandals, and countless videos of them dancing in the kitchen of the King Roadhouse. They were young, they were loved, and they were entirely unaware that they were being watched. The community of Moscow thrived on this energy. In a town of 25,000 people, the university was the engine that drove everything. Residents and students mingled in the local diners and coffee shops, creating an atmosphere where everyone felt like a neighbor. The local police department was more accustomed to noise complaints and minor scuffles than violent crime. There hadn't been a murder in Moscow in 7 years. It was the kind of place where parents felt safe sending their children, believing that the biggest dangers were the icy roads in winter or the occasional overindulgence at a fraternity party. This innocence was the foundation of their lives. They operated under the assumption that the world was fundamentally good, or at least that their small corner of it was exempt from the darkness that made headlines in big cities. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, the house at 1122 King Road was as busy as ever. With the Thanksgiving break approaching, there was an air of excitement. Students were planning their trips home, finishing up projects, and squeezing in a few more nights of socializing before the campus quieted down for the holiday. Maddie and Kaylee were finalizing their post-graduation plans. Zana was looking forward to more time with Ethan, and the 2 surviving roommates who lived on the first floor were going about their daily routines. The house was a sanctuary of friendship, filled with the mundane but beautiful details of 4 lives in full bloom, half-finished textbooks on the coffee table, a collection of shoes by the door, and the sound of laughter echoing through the hallways. They were standing at the pinnacle of their youth, looking out at a future that seemed limitless, never imagining that a shadow was already beginning to stretch toward their door. While the world within the King Roadhouse was one of light and connection, a starkly different reality was unfolding just 8 miles away across the state line in Pullman, Washington. Brian Christopher Kohberger, a 28-year-old PhD student at Washington State University, existed in a realm of clinical observation and profound social detachment. To understand the shadow that began to loom over Moscow, one must look into the history of a man who spent his life studying the very darkest corners of the human psyche, perhaps as a way to understand the void within himself. Kohberger was not a typical student. He was a man obsessed with the mechanics of crime, the psychology of the offender, and the intricate dance between the predator and the law. Born in 1994 and raised in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, Kohberger's early life was marked by a struggle for control. In his youth, he dealt with significant weight issues and social alienation, often becoming the target of bullying. Those who knew him then described a dramatic transformation in his late teens, a period where he lost a massive amount of weight but seemed to gain a sharp, almost aggressive edge to his personality. He became a student of martial arts, a discipline that provided him with a sense of physical dominance he had previously lacked. However, this newfound confidence was often perceived as arrogance. He was remembered as highly intelligent but socially abrasive, frequently challenging those around him with a cold, analytical intensity that made casual friendship nearly impossible. This analytical drive eventually found a home in academia. Kohberger pursued a degree in psychology and then a master's in criminal justice at DeSales University. It was here that his interest in the minds of killers deepened. He studied under a renowned forensic psychologist known for her work with serial killers like Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. While most students approached criminology with a desire to uphold justice, Kohberger seemed fascinated by the why, the internal state of the offender during the act. This was evidenced by a research project he initiated on Reddit, where he sought out former prisoners to answer detailed questions about their crimes. He wanted to know how they felt when they approached their victims, how they chose their targets, and what thoughts occupied their minds as they committed their deeds. He was, in essence, building a map of the criminal soul. In the summer of 2022, Kohberger moved to Pullman to begin his doctoral studies at WSU. His arrival coincided with a noticeable shift in his behavior. As a teaching assistant, he was described by his students as either a tough grader, who was distant and robotic, or as someone who would suddenly become erratic, swinging from harshness to total disengagement. He lived alone in a quiet apartment complex where neighbors rarely saw him, except for the late-night sounds of him pacing or the occasional glimpse of his white 2015 Hyundai Elantra pulling into his spot in the early morning hours. He was a man of strict routine, following a vegan diet so rigorous that he reportedly asked his family to buy new pots and pans because his old ones might have meat residue. It was a level of control that bordered on the obsessive, a need to keep his environment sterile and his mind sharp. But beneath this sterile exterior, a different kind of obsession was taking root. Investigative data would later suggest that Kohberger's phone had pinged in the vicinity of the King Road house at least 12 times in the months leading up to the murders. These visits almost always occurred late at night or in the very early morning hours. While the students inside were sleeping or celebrating their youth, a silent observer was likely sitting in the darkness outside, learning the rhythms of the house. He was studying the layout, the entry points, and the vulnerabilities of a home that felt safe because it was full of life. He wasn't just a student of criminology anymore. He was a student of this specific location, applying his academic knowledge to a real-world target. The contrast between Kohberger and his victims was absolute. Kaylee, Maddie, Zana, and Ethan were defined by their capacity for joy and their deep ties to one another. Kohberger was defined by his isolation and his cold, intellectual distance from humanity. In his mind, people may have been little more than variables in an equation he was trying to solve. His social awkwardness, his history of being an outcast, and his intense focus on the perfect crime were converging into a dangerous singular point. He was a man who felt he was smarter than the systems designed to catch him, a man who believed he could step into the role of the predator and remain invisible. As the autumn leaves fell in Moscow and Pullman, the distance between these two worlds began to close. Kohberger continued his duties at WSU, attending classes and grading papers on the very theories of crime he was allegedly preparing to put into practice. He was hiding in plain sight, a predator dressed in the garb of a scholar. He was a shadow moving through a world of golden light, waiting for the moment when the lights at 1122 King Road would finally go out. The intersection of his clinical obsession and the vibrant lives of the four students was about to result in a collision that would forever change the landscape of the Palouse. He had spent years studying the darkness. Now he was ready to become part of it. The night of November 12, 2022, began like any other Saturday in a college town, vibrant, loud, and filled with the invincible energy of youth. But as the clock pushed past midnight into the early hours of Sunday, November 13th, the atmosphere in Moscow shifted. A biting chill settled over the Palouse, and the revelry of the evening began to dissolve into a heavy suburban silence. At 1122 King Road, the lights in the multi-level house began to flicker out one by one. The residents had returned from their various nights out. Maddie Mogan and Kaylee Gonkalves had been at a local bar and a food truck. Zana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin had been at a fraternity party. By 2 a.m., the house was settling into a quiet rhythm. But outside, in the shadows of the tree line and the winding roads that skirted the campus, a white 2015 Hyundai Elantra was circling, a mechanical shark in a sea of dark asphalt. The movements of that car, captured later by a patchwork of private security cameras and doorbell feeds, told the story of a predator searching for the right moment to strike. Between 3:29 a.m. and 4:04 a.m., the vehicle was seen passing the King Road residence 3 times, each pass a calculation, each turn a refinement of a plan. Finally, at 4:04 a.m., the car made its 4th and final appearance. It executed a sharp 3-point turn in the middle of the road and came to a halt. The engine went silent. The world outside the house was still, frozen in the amber glow of the streetlights. Inside, the victims were in their beds, some asleep, one or two perhaps still drifting in the half-light of a late-night snack or a final scroll through a phone. They had no way of knowing that the sliding glass door on the second floor, an entry point that had always felt like a convenience, was about to become a breach. The entry was likely silent. The killer stepped into the kitchen area on the second floor, a space that smelled of college life, abandoned pizza boxes, the faint scent of laundry detergent, and the lingering warmth of a home. He moved with a terrifying familiarity, his destination set. He didn't wander. He didn't hesitate. He climbed the stairs to the third floor, where Maddie and Kaylee were sleeping in Maddie's bed. This was the sanctuary of two best friends, a room filled with photos and memories of a lifetime of friendship. In the darkness, the violence was sudden and absolute. The weapon, a heavy, fixed-blade Ka-bar-style knife, was designed for war, not for a quiet bedroom in Idaho. Within seconds, the two girls who had spent their lives side by side were gone, their futures stolen before they could even grasp the reality of the shadow standing over them. But the nightmare was only halfway finished. The intruder descended back to the second floor. In one of the bedrooms, Zana Kernodle had recently received a DoorDash order. Her phone records would later show she was active on TikTok as late as 4:12 a.m. She was awake. She was alive. And then, she heard something. One of the surviving roommates, whose bedroom was on the second floor, would later describe being awakened by what she thought was the sound of Kaylee playing with her dog on the floor above. A short time later, she thought she heard someone say, "There's someone here." She looked out of her door but saw nothing. A few moments later, the silence was broken by the sound of muffled crying coming from Zana's room, followed by a male voice, low, calm, and bone-chillingly steady, saying something to the effect of, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." It wasn't help. It was a cold-blooded execution. The struggle in Zana's room was more pronounced, a desperate fight for survival in a narrow space. Ethan, the gentle giant who had spent the evening making his girlfriend laugh, was caught in the onslaught. The sheer brutality of the attack was a testament to the killer's focus. He was a man who had studied the physiology of death, and now he was witnessing it in real time, beneath his own hands. The air in the house grew heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the suffocating pressure of a violence so extreme it felt alien to the walls of a student rental. The surviving roommate, gripped by a paralyzing instinctual fear, opened her door for the third time. This time, she saw him. A figure clad in black, masked, moving toward her. She described him as having bushy eyebrows, a detail that would later haunt the public imagination. He didn't stop. He didn't turn toward her. He walked past her with a clinical, detached gait, heading toward the sliding glass door he had entered through minutes earlier. He left her standing in the doorway, frozen in a frozen shock phase, as he vanished back into the night. At 4:20 a.m., the white Elantra was seen on camera again, tearing away from the scene at a high rate of speed, leaving the hills of Moscow behind and disappearing toward the Washington border. Behind him, 1122 King Road was a tomb. The silence that followed was more deafening than the struggle. In the dark, 4 young hearts had stopped beating, their dreams scattered like the dust in the hallway. The survivors, traumatized and confused by the white noise of the crime, remained in their rooms, unaware of the full scale of the carnage just feet away. The sun began to rise over the Palouse, casting a pale light on a house that would soon become the center of a global investigation. The killer had done what he came to do. He had stepped out of the shadows, enacted a fantasy of total dominance, and slipped away into the morning mist, likely believing that his academic preparation and his careful evasion of the cameras had made him a ghost. He was wrong. In his wake, he had left a microscopic trail, a biological signature on a leather knife sheath left beside a victim's body, that would eventually pull the world down upon him. But for now, as the town of Moscow began to wake up, the only reality was the cold, silent horror waiting behind the front door. The sun rose over Moscow on the morning of November 13th, casting a pale, indifferent light on the quiet neighborhood around King Road. Inside the house, a heavy, unnatural silence had replaced the typical Sunday morning sounds of waking students. It wasn't until nearly noon that the first tremors of the coming earthquake were felt. The surviving roommates, having finally ventured out of their rooms, encountered a scene so horrific that the mind instinctively refused to process it. Chaos soon followed. Friends were called, a 911 report was made concerning an unconscious person, and the first responders arrived at a scene that would haunt their professional careers forever. As the yellow crime scene tape began to unfurl around the property, the town of Moscow began to realize that its long era of safety had ended in a single night of unimaginable violence. The news broke like a physical blow. Initially, the details were sparse, but the reality was undeniable. 4 University of Idaho students, Maddie, Kaylee, Zana, and Ethan, were dead. The shock was immediate and total. This was a community where people left their cars running while they ran into the store, and where the blue light emergency poles on campus felt more like relics of a more dangerous world than a necessity. Suddenly, that world had arrived on their doorstep. For the next 48 days, Moscow became a city under siege, not by an army, but by a shadow. The atmosphere transformed from one of collegiate vibrancy to one of stifling, suffocating fear. Students who had once walked the campus paths alone at night now moved in groups, their keys clutched between their knuckles. The local hardware stores sold out of deadbolts and window locks within 48 hours. Every creak of a floorboard or rustle of wind against a window became a potential intruder. The investigation began in a state of high-pressure silence. Local police, joined quickly by the Idaho State Police and a massive contingent from the FBI, moved with a clinical precision that the public mistook for inactivity. For weeks, the authorities held back the most gruesome details of the crime, leading to a vacuum of information that was quickly filled by the internet's dark speculation. True crime detectives on social media began dissecting every pixel of the victims' digital lives, casting suspicion on grieving friends, family members, and even the surviving roommates. The rumors were a secondary trauma for a town already in mourning. While the public demanded an immediate arrest, the investigators were sifting through thousands of tips and thousands of hours of grainy surveillance footage, looking for a needle in a haystack of digital noise. The search for the ghost led to the identification of a specific vehicle, a white Hyundai Elantra. This car became the focal point of the investigation's public face. Police across the country were told to look for a 2011 to 2013 model, though the actual vehicle was a 2015. While the public looked for the car, the FBI was already working on a much more sophisticated hunt. They were analyzing cellular tower pings and utilizing forensic genealogy, a cutting-edge technique that uses public DNA databases to build family trees. On the 3rd floor of the King Road house, the killer had left behind a singular, fatal mistake, a tan leather knife sheath. On the button snap of that sheath, a single trace of male DNA had been recovered. It was a microscopic calling card, a biological signature that the killer likely believed he had cleaned, or that wouldn't matter in the absence of a direct match in a criminal database. As November turned into a freezing December, the pressure on the Moscow Police Department became unbearable. National news outlets camped out on the streets, their bright lights illuminating the dark, snowy hills. Every press conference was a gauntlet of pointed questions about why there were no suspects and why the community should still feel safe. The police chief, visibly exhausted, repeated the same mantra. They were following the evidence, and they were committed to justice. Behind the scenes, the net was tightening. They had identified a white Elantra at Washington State University, just a short drive away in Pullman. The owner was a graduate student named Brian Koberger. They had his name, they had his car, and now they needed his DNA to bridge the gap between suspicion and a warrant. The search followed Koberger across the country. Shortly after the fall semester ended, he began a cross-country drive with his father, returning to Pennsylvania for the winter break. They were followed every mile of the way. FBI teams watched as the Elantra moved through the heart of America, stop after stop, while the legal team in Idaho worked to finalize the evidence. In the early morning hours of December 30th, the silence finally broke. A tactical team descended on the Koberger family home in the Pocono Mountains. The ghost was no longer a shadow. He was a man in handcuffs. In Moscow, the news of the arrest brought a wave of relief so powerful it felt like a collective exhale. But the relief was tempered by a new, chilling realization. The suspect wasn't a local drifter or a random intruder. He was a scholar of the law, a man who lived among them, who had potentially sat in the same coffee shops and walked the same streets while the town lived in terror. The 48 days of fear had ended, but the long journey toward understanding why was just beginning. The community began to gather for vigils, the golden light of thousands of candles reflecting off the snow as they started the slow, painful process of reclamation. They had found their suspect, but they still had to find a way to live in a world where such darkness was possible. The arrest of Bryan Kohberger in the early hours of December 30th, 2022, was not the result of a single smoking gun, but rather the culmination of a massive multi-agency effort that wove together traditional detective work with cutting-edge digital and biological surveillance. When the tactical teams moved in on the Kohberger family home in Chestnut Hill Township, Pennsylvania, they weren't just acting on a hunch. They were the final hammer blow in an investigation that had spent weeks meticulously building a net around a man who had gone to great lengths to remain invisible. This phase of the case shifted the focus from the grief-stricken streets of Moscow to the clinical, high-tech labs of the FBI and the sprawling digital records of cellular providers and automotive databases. The first critical piece of the puzzle was the white 2015 Hyundai Elantra. While the public had been looking for a slightly older model based on initial police requests, investigators were narrowing their search by cross-referencing surveillance footage with vehicle registration records at nearby Washington State University. They discovered that a student named Bryan Kohberger had registered a white 2015 Elantra and had even changed his license plate from Pennsylvania to Washington just days after the murders. This wasn't illegal, but in the context of a quadruple homicide where a similar car was seen fleeing the scene, it was a significant red flag. Analysts began a deep dive into his background, discovering a man who was deeply embedded in the study of the criminal mind, a PhD student in criminology who likely understood exactly how the police would try to catch him. But car sightings were circumstantial. To bridge the gap to a search warrant, the investigation turned to the digital trail Kohberger left in his wake. Investigators served geofence warrants and requested cellular data from towers serving the Moscow and Pullman areas. The results were staggering. They found that Kohberger's phone had pinged near 1122 King Road at least 12 times in the months leading up to the attack, often in the late hours of the night or the early hours of the morning. On the night of the murders, however, his phone went dark. Records showed the device was turned off or placed in airplane mode at 2:47 a.m., just as he was allegedly leaving Pullman. It did not reappear on the network until 4:48 a.m., south of Moscow, as he was making a circuitous route back to his apartment. This 2-hour gap aligned perfectly with the timeline of the murders, suggesting a deliberate attempt to evade cellular tracking during the commission of the crime. While the digital net was tightening, a biological breakthrough was brewing in a lab hundreds of miles away. During the initial processing of the crime scene, investigators had recovered a tan leather knife sheath on the 3rd floor, lying on the bed next to Maddie Mogan. This was the killer's most significant oversight. Forensic technicians managed to extract a single source of male DNA from the button snap of that sheath. This was the biological signature the team needed. However, Kohberger's DNA was not in any criminal database. To find their match, the FBI utilized investigative genetic genealogy, the same revolutionary technique used to catch the Golden State Killer. They uploaded the profile to public ancestry databases, building a family tree that eventually pointed directly toward the Kohberger family in Pennsylvania. To confirm their suspicions without tipping off the suspect, investigators had to get creative. While Kohberger was home in Pennsylvania for winter break, agents conducted a covert trash pull at his parents' residence. They sifted through the family's discarded items and recovered DNA from Kohberger's father. Lab results showed that the DNA found on the trash was a 99.99% match for the father of the person who left DNA on the knife sheath in Idaho. It was the definitive link. The DNA on the sheath belonged to Bryan Kohberger. This biological evidence, combined with the cellular tracking and the identification of his car, provided the probable cause necessary for a judge to sign off on the arrest and search warrants. The investigation didn't stop with the arrest. Once Koberger was in custody and his Pullman apartment and Pennsylvania home were searched, more pieces of the puzzle began to surface. Investigators found a collection of dark clothing and a computer that showed he had been following the news of the Moscow murders with obsessive detail. They also discovered that he had allegedly messaged one of the victims on Instagram multiple times in the weeks before the attack, though she had never responded. This pointed to a targeted stalking behavior, a predator who had chosen his victims and spent months studying them before finally deciding to act. The forensic investigation into the Idaho student murders remains one of the most complex in modern history. It showcased a new era of policing where a killer can no longer rely on a lack of a criminal record to stay hidden. Every digital interaction, every microscopic trace of skin or hair, and every captured frame of a security camera is a potential witness. Koberger, a man who studied these very systems, found himself trapped by the very technology he likely thought he could manipulate. He had tried to be a ghost, but in the end, he was undone by a single button snap and a trail of cellular pings that told the story of his movements better than any eyewitness ever could. The digital and biological net had closed, and for the families of the victims, it was the first step toward a justice that had once felt as distant as the stars. The road to justice for the families of Maddie, Kaylee, Zana, and Ethan was long and filled with agonizing procedural delays. For years, Brian Koberger's defense team filed motion after motion, challenging everything from the use of investigative genetic genealogy to the venue of the trial itself. The case was eventually moved from Lotta County to Boise to ensure a fair trial, but the weight of the evidence continued to mount. By the time 2025 arrived, the prosecution had built a fortress of forensic data. The DNA on the knife sheath, the digital footprint of his cellular pings, and the video evidence of his white Elantra. The perfect crime Koberger may have envisioned was unraveling under the scrutiny of a judicial system he had spent his life studying. In July 2025, the legal chess match reached an abrupt and somber conclusion. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, Brian Koberger stood before a silent, packed courtroom and entered a guilty plea to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. It was a moment of profound gravity. The man who had spent months maintaining a mask of clinical detachment finally admitted to the unthinkable. For the families seated in the gallery, the plea was a double-edged sword. It avoided the trauma of a protracted, gruesome trial, but it also forced them to hear the word guilty from the lips of the man who had stolen their children's futures. The sentencing hearing was a powerful testament to the lives lost. One by one, the families stood to deliver victim impact statements, describing the hollow silence left behind in their homes. They spoke of the graduations that never happened, the weddings that would never take place, and the birthdays marked only by visits to a cemetery. The judge, noting the calculated and unfathomably cruel nature of the crimes, delivered the final blow. Koberger was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for burglary. There was no chance of redemption, no hope of release. The net that had begun with a single microscopic trace of DNA had finally, permanently closed. The house at 1122 King Road no longer stands. In late 2023, the university demolished the structure, turning the site of such profound darkness into an empty lot of quiet earth, a physical erasure of a nightmare that the community desperately needed. But while the building is gone, the memory of Kaylee, Maddie, Zana, and Ethan remains etched into the spirit of Moscow. The Palouse has regained its silence, but it is a different kind of quiet now, one tempered by a loss of innocence and a permanent awareness of the fragility of peace. Brian Koberger's legacy is not one of a perfect crime, but of a profound failure of the human spirit, undone by the very systems he thought he could outsmart. Justice, in its final form, was not a grand gesture, but a somber admission of guilt in a Boise courtroom, ensuring he will never again step into the light. As the snow falls over the hills of Idaho, it covers a landscape forever changed, reminding us that while evil can strike in the shadows, it is the light of community and the persistence of truth that ultimately prevails. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. The Texas heat in July is more than just a temperature. It is a physical presence that slows the pulse of the suburbs. In spring, a quiet enclave north of Houston, July 9, 2014, began like any other Wednesday. The streets were lined with manicured lawns and the kind of silence that suggests a deep, unwavering safety. In this landscape of domestic predictability, the arrival of a delivery van is a non-event, a ghost in the machine of daily life. Shortly before 6 in the evening, a white van pulled to the curb in front of a 2-story home on Leaflet Lane. The man who stepped out didn't look like a threat. He was draped in the professional anonymity of a FedEx uniform, carrying a package that served as his ticket into the lives of the people inside. He moved with a practiced, casual rhythm, the gait of someone with a job to do and a schedule to keep. He reached the porch and knocked, the sound echoing through the house where the Stay children were winding down their afternoon. 15-year-old Cassidy Stay approached the door, seeing the familiar logo through the glass. She expected a signature or a simple exchange. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with a man who had traveled hundreds of miles with a singular, lethal intent. As the door opened, the scorching Texas air rushed in, and with it, a darkness that no one in the neighborhood could have anticipated. The man in the uniform wasn't a stranger. He was a ghost from the family's past, and he was through with waiting. The package was dropped, the deception was over, and the sanctuary of the home was about to be breached by a man who had traded his humanity for a mission of absolute, cold-blooded vengeance. The Avenger had arrived, and he was already across the threshold. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the magnitude of the darkness that descended on Leaflet Lane, one must first look at the light that filled the home of Stephen and Katie Stay. In the sprawling suburbs of Spring, Texas, the Stays weren't just a family. They were a pillar. Their house was the kind of place where the door was rarely locked during the day, and the kitchen was a perpetual motion machine of snacks, homework, and laughter. This was a household defined by a deliberate, joyful chaos, the kind that only comes from raising 5 children with a 6th on the way in spirit, as they navigated the complexities of modern life with a deep-rooted faith and a commitment to their community. Stephen Stay, 40, was the quintessential family man. He possessed a gentle, steady presence that balanced the high energy of a house full of growing children. Stephen was a real estate broker, a profession that suited his gregarious nature and his genuine desire to help people find their own sense of home. He wasn't just selling property, he was helping neighbors build lives. Those who worked with him remembered a man who prioritized integrity over a commission, someone who would spend hours explaining the fine print to a first-time buyer. In his spare time, he was a leader in the local Mormon community, serving as a lay pastor and a mentor to young men. He was the guy you called when your car broke down, or when you needed someone to help move a heavy sofa across town. He lived his life according to a simple, unshakable code: show up, work hard, and love your family. Katie Stay, 34, was the heart of the operation. She was a woman of boundless energy and a sharp, maternal wit. Friends described her as the glue of the neighborhood. While Stephen was out in the community, Katie was the one organizing the block parties, the school fundraisers, and the church youth events. She had a way of making every child feel like they were the most important person in the room. Her days were a marathon of logistics, shuttling kids to soccer practice, overseeing music lessons, and ensuring that despite the large number of mouths to feed, dinner was a time for connection. Katie didn't just manage a household, she curated an environment of safety and belonging. She was fiercely protective of her own, but she also opened her heart to those outside her immediate circle, including her sister Melanie, whose troubled marriage would eventually cast a long, lethal shadow over the Stay residents. Then there were the children, the vibrant, pulsing lifeblood of the home. At 15, Cassidy was the eldest, already stepping into a role of responsibility and poise that would later define her survival. She was the one the younger siblings looked up to, the one who helped Katie with the toddlers and managed the shifting moods of a large family. Behind her were 4 brothers and a sister, ranging from the toddler years to early adolescence. 4-year-old Zach was the baby of the family, a bundle of blonde curls and endless questions, who was never far from his mother's side. 7-year-old Rebecca was the dreamer, often found with a book or a set of crayons, lost in a world of her own making. Then there were the middle boys, Brian, 13, and James, 9, who turned the backyard into a permanent stadium for whatever sport was in season. To see them together was to see a spectrum of potential, a group of children who were being raised to be kind, curious, and resilient. The sound of the stay home was a symphony of slamming screen doors, the rhythmic bounce of a basketball on the driveway, and the overlapping voices of children who knew, without question, that they were loved. Their life in spring was the American dream realized in its most sincere form. It wasn't about the luxury of the home itself, though it was a beautiful, spacious residence. It was about the atmosphere within the walls. Neighbors often remarked on the stay energy, a sense of warmth that seemed to spill out onto the sidewalk. On summer evenings, you might see the family gathered on the porch or working together in the yard. There was no hint of the tragedy to come, no cracks in the facade because there was no facade to begin with. They were exactly who they appeared to be, a family rooted in love, trying to do right by each other and their neighbors. The tragedy of the Haskell intrusion is amplified by the sheer normalcy of what it destroyed. When we look at the stays, we see ourselves or the neighbors we wish we had. We see the routine of a Wednesday evening, the smell of laundry detergent and whatever was simmering on the stove, the scattered shoes in the entryway, the low hum of the television in the background. It was a fortress of domesticity, built on a foundation of trust. They had no reason to fear a man in a uniform. In their world, a knock at the door was an opportunity for a conversation, a delivery was a mundane errand, and a stranger was just a friend they hadn't met yet. Stephen and Katie had built a world where the biggest worries were grades, sports scores, and the logistics of the next church social. They were blissfully unaware that miles away, a different kind of life was unfolding, one fueled by a toxic cocktail of entitlement, rage, and a meticulous, cold-blooded plan. While the stays were celebrating the small victories of daily life, Ronald Haskell was obsessing over their destruction, viewing their happiness not as an inspiration, but as an affront to his own failures. The contrast between the two men, Stephen, the builder of homes, and Ronald, the destroyer of families, is the central, haunting pivot of this story. One represented the best of the suburban ideal. The other was the nightmare lurking just out of sight, waiting for the sun to dip low enough to make his move. To look at Ronald Lee Haskell was to see a man who appeared, on the surface, to be entirely unremarkable. Born in 1981, he was a man who had moved through the world with the quiet, simmering resentment of someone who believed the universe owed him a debt it never intended to pay. By 2014, he was 33 years old, but his history was already a roadmap of bridges burned and lives fractured. His story is not one of a sudden snap, but of a long, calculated descent, a slow-motion train wreck fueled by a desperate need for control and a refusal to take responsibility for his own failures. The genesis of the horror that would unfold in Texas began years earlier in Utah, within the confines of his marriage to Melanie K. Stay, the sister of Katie Stay. When Ronald and Melanie first married in 2002, there were hopes for a traditional, stable life. They moved into a home in Logan, Utah, and eventually had 4 children of their own. But the domestic bliss Melanie sought was quickly replaced by a suffocating atmosphere of psychological and physical intimidation. Ronald wasn't just a husband, he was a warden. Those who knew the couple began to see a disturbing pattern. Ronald used isolation as a weapon. He didn't want Melanie to have a life outside of his gaze, and he viewed her family, the vibrant, supportive Stays, not as relatives, but as competitors for her loyalty. The cracks in the marriage weren't just private arguments. They were documented in police reports and court filings that now serve as a chilling prologue to the massacre. Over the years, Melanie reported multiple instances of domestic violence. She described a man who would flip from cold silence to explosive rage in a heartbeat. In 2008, he was arrested for domestic violence in the presence of a child and simple assault. The records painted a picture of a man who would pull his wife's hair, choke her, and threaten her in front of their small children. To Ronald, these weren't crimes, they were corrections. He possessed a toxic sense of entitlement that dictated everyone in his orbit must bend to his will or face the consequences. As the abuse escalated, the Stay family, led by the fiercely protective Katie, did what any loving family would do. They intervened. They provided Melanie with the emotional and logistical support she needed to realize that the life she was living was not a marriage, but a hostage situation. This intervention was the moment Ronald's resentment toward the Stays crystallized into a singular, burning hatred. He didn't see Katie and Stephen as people trying to save their sister. He saw them as thieves who were stealing his property. In his mind, the Stays were the architects of his misery. If his house was falling apart, it was because they had weakened the foundation. If his wife was leaving him, it was because they had poisoned her mind. The final collapse began in 2013. Melanie, finally finding the strength to break the cycle, moved out and filed for divorce. She took the children and sought a protective order, effectively cutting off the oxygen Ronald used to fuel his ego. For a man defined by control, this was the ultimate humiliation. He was no longer the master of his domain. He was a man living in his parents' home in San Marcos, California, brooding over the ruins of his life. He watched from a distance as Melanie began to rebuild, supported by the very people he blamed for his downfall. During this period, Ronald's behavior became increasingly erratic, though there was always a chilling undercurrent of logic to his actions. He spent time in and out of mental health facilities, a fact his defense would later lean on heavily. He claimed to hear voices, demons that told him what to do. But investigators and family members saw something else, a man who was weaponizing his instability to evade accountability. While he was telling doctors about his delusions, he was also making very real, very specific threats. He told his own mother that he would hurt her family if they didn't help him find Melanie. He was a predator who was testing the fences, looking for a way back into the lives of those who had escaped him. His grudge against the Stays was particularly sharp because of what they represented. Stephen and Katie had the life he felt he deserved, a successful business, a large, happy family, and a house filled with the kind of genuine love he could only mimic. To Ronald, their happiness was a taunt. Every photo of the Stay children, every story of their success, was a reminder of what he had lost, or rather, what he had thrown away. He stopped seeing them as human beings and began to see them as obstacles that needed to be removed. He didn't want his family back as much as he wanted to ensure that no one else could be happy if he wasn't. In the months leading up to July 2014, Ronald's focus narrowed. He wasn't just a man struggling with a divorce, he was a man on a mission of annihilation. He began researching the Stays' location, their routines, and the layout of their neighborhood. This wasn't the behavior of someone lost in a psychotic fog. This was the FedEx precision that would later shock the nation. He was calculating drive times, scouting the distance from California to Texas, and acquiring the tools he would need to carry out his plan. He didn't choose the FedEx uniform by accident. It was a calculated exploitation of suburban trust. He knew that in a neighborhood like Spring, a delivery driver was invisible. He knew that the Stays, in their kindness, would open the door. The transformation was complete. The unremarkable man from Utah had become a dedicated student of vengeance. He had stripped away his roles as a husband, a father, and a son, leaving only the avenger. He blamed the Stays for the restraining orders, for the loss of his children, and for the fact that he was sleeping in a spare room in California instead of a master bedroom in Utah. He had convinced himself that by destroying the Stays, he would somehow balance the scales of his life. It was a dark, hollow logic that ignored the reality of his own violence and replaced it with a narrative where he was the victim and they were the villains. As he began the long drive from San Marcos toward the Texas border, Ronald Haskell carried with him more than just a firearm and a stolen uniform. He carried a decade of accumulated rage, a meticulous plan, and a heart that had long since been emptied of empathy. He wasn't going to Texas to talk, to plead, or to reconcile. He was going there to finish a story he believed the Stays had started. The predator was no longer lurking in the shadows of the past. He was on the highway, moving at 60 miles per hour toward a quiet cul-de-sac, ready to turn a sunny Wednesday afternoon into a permanent midnight. The path that led Ronald Haskell to the driveway of the Stay family was paved with a decade of escalating psychological warfare and a series of alarming, overlooked red flags. The breakdown of the Haskell marriage wasn't a quiet drifting apart. It was a violent, jagged disintegration that sent shockwaves through the entire extended family. To understand why the Stays became the focal point of Ronald's final act of vengeance, one must look at the specific way the family, and Katie Stay in particular, became the shield between Ronald and his primary victim, Melanie. The dynamic was established long before the 2013 divorce. Ronald's brand of abuse was rooted in a profound need for total dominion over his wife's life. He viewed any connection she had with her siblings as an act of rebellion, a breach in the walls of the psychological prison he had built for her. Melanie had reported that Ronald would often use their 4 children as pawns in his games of control. He would threaten to disappear with them or tell them horrific stories about their mother to undermine her authority and her sanity. When Melanie finally reached her breaking point, she didn't just leave a husband. She escaped a cult of personality. In late 2013, the legal system finally caught up with Ronald, but the consequences served only to sharpen his focus. After years of documented abuse, Melanie was granted a protective order and full custody of their children. For Ronald, this was a cosmic injustice. He didn't see himself as an abuser who had lost his family through his own actions. He saw himself as a man who had been robbed of his property by a conspiratorial family. In his mind, Melanie was too weak to have done this on her own. He convinced himself that Katie and Stephen Stay were the true architects of his ruin. He believed they had financed her legal team, encouraged her to seek the protective orders, and were hiding her and the children from him. During this period, Ronald moved back to his parents' home in San Marcos, California, but his presence there was anything but peaceful. His parents, caught in the impossible position of loving a man who was clearly spiraling, became the first targets of his redirected rage. He began to exhibit behavior that vacillated between catatonic depression and terrifying, focused aggression. He was hospitalized several times for mental health evaluations, yet each time he managed to mask his homicidal ideations just enough to be released. He played the role of the broken man for doctors, while at home he was a silent, simmering threat. The threats became explicit in the months leading up to the massacre. He didn't just talk about wanting his family back, he talked about erasing those who kept them from him. In one particularly chilling incident, he became so aggressive with his own mother that she felt compelled to seek a restraining order against him. He had physically restrained her to a chair and told her that her entire family was going to pay for what had happened to him. He wasn't just talking about his wife, he was talking about the Stays in Texas. Despite these warnings, Ronald remained free, his movements untracked, and his intentions shrouded in the mental illness defense he was already beginning to cultivate. Ronald's obsession with the Stays was fueled by the support they provided Melanie. In a world where Ronald wanted his wife isolated and helpless, Katie Stay was a formidable opponent. Katie was strong, vocal, and unshakable in her support for her sister. She helped Melanie navigate the bureaucracy of divorce and provided the emotional anchor Melanie needed to stay away from Ronald's manipulative pleas. To Ronald, Katie wasn't just a sister-in-law, she was the commander of the opposition. Every time Melanie refused to take his call or ignored a manipulative text, Ronald attributed it to Katie's influence. He began to view the Stay home in Spring, Texas, as the command center of the forces aligned against him. The financial aspect of his failure also played a massive role in his mounting resentment. While Ronald was unemployed and living off his parents, Stephen Stay was a successful real estate broker, providing a comfortable, affluent life for his 6 children. Ronald's jealousy was corrosive. He would spend hours scouring social media for any glimpse of the Stays' lives. He saw their vacations, their church activities, and the smiles of their children, and he compared it to the wreckage of his own existence. He felt that the Stays were winning, and in his zero-sum worldview, their success was directly responsible for his failure. The transition from brooding resentment to tactical planning occurred in early 2014. Ronald began to gather intelligence with the cold efficiency of a military scout. He knew he couldn't just show up at their door. He knew they would recognize his car or his face. He needed a disguise, a way to get past the threshold before they knew who he was. He stole a FedEx uniform, a garment that carries with it an automatic passport into any American home. He acquired a firearm, a tool he had used before to intimidate Melanie, but now one he intended to use for a definitive purpose. As the summer of 2014 approached, the breakdown was complete. Ronald was no longer trying to fix his life. He was preparing to end the lives of those he hated. He began the long 2-day drive from California to Texas, a journey of nearly 1,500 miles. During that drive, he had plenty of time to turn back, plenty of time for the voices he claimed to hear to tell him to stop. But he didn't stop. He drove with a singular, dark purpose, stopping only for gas and food, his mind locked on the image of the house on Leaflet Lane. The Stay family, meanwhile, had no idea that the ghost of Melanie's past was barreling toward them. They had done everything right. They had followed the law, they had supported their sister, and they had built a life based on kindness and community. They were unaware that in the twisted mind of Ronald Haskell, their very goodness had become a death sentence. The breakdown of the Haskell marriage had created a vacuum of rage that Ronald was now bringing to their doorstep. He wasn't just a disgruntled ex-husband, he was a self-appointed avenger who believed that by destroying the Stays, he would finally find the justice he felt the world had denied him. He was less than 100 miles from Spring, the FedEx uniform folded in his bag, his gun loaded, and his heart set on a massacre that would ensure no one in that family would ever smile again. The clock in the Stay kitchen ticked toward 6 p.m., a time when the rhythm of the household usually shifted toward the evening meal and the winding down of another Texas summer day. The sun was still high, casting long, sharp shadows across the driveway where the children's bikes lay on their sides. Inside, the air conditioning hummed, a mechanical shield against the oppressive 90-degree heat. Stephen and Katie were not yet home. They were out on errands, leaving the house in the capable hands of 15-year-old Cassidy. For Cassidy, it was a normal afternoon of supervising her younger siblings, a task she handled with a maturity that far exceeded her years. There was no sense of impending doom, no shivering intuition of the monster currently navigating the suburban grid toward their front door. At approximately 5:30 p.m., the white van came to a halt. Ronald Haskell sat in the driver's seat. The stolen FedEx uniform felt stiff and alien against his skin. He adjusted the bill of his cap, pulling it low to obscure his eyes. In his hands, he held a clipboard and a decoy package, the ultimate Trojan horse for the modern age. He wasn't rushing. His movements were slow, deliberate, and drained of all visible emotion. He was no longer the man who had cried in mental health wards or the man who had pleaded with his mother for help. He was a technician of death, and he was about to clock in. He walked to the door and knocked. It was a firm, professional sound, the kind of knock that implies a delivery that requires a signature. Inside, Cassidy heard the sound and moved toward the entryway. Through the glass, she saw the familiar colors of the uniform. She didn't hesitate. Why would she? In a world of online shopping and constant deliveries, a man at the door with a package was as common as a car driving down the street. She opened the door, expecting to sign a screen or take a box. Instead, she was met with a question. The man asked for her parents by name. He was calm, his voice steady, betraying nothing of the furnace of rage burning beneath his ribs. Cassidy, polite and unsuspecting, informed him that her parents weren't home at the moment. She offered to take the package or have them call him later. It was then that the mask began to slip, though only slightly. The man didn't leave. He didn't turn back to his van. He stood his ground, the weight of his presence suddenly feeling heavy and wrong. He asked again, more firmly, where they were and when they would be back. Cassidy began to feel the first prickle of unease. This wasn't the behavior of a delivery driver. She tried to close the door, a split-second instinct for self-preservation, but Haskell was faster. He kicked the door open, the force of his entry throwing the teenage girl backward, before she could scream. before she could process the transition from a mundane afternoon to a violent home invasion. He was inside. He wasn't waving the gun wildly. He drew it with the same methodical precision he had used to knock on the door. He told Cassidy to stay quiet and gathered the younger children into the living room. Imagine the confusion of the younger siblings: 7-year-old Rebecca, 9-year-old James, 13-year-old Brian, and 4-year-old Zach. They saw a man in a trusted uniform holding a weapon. They saw their older sister, their protector, suddenly rendered helpless. Haskell didn't treat them like children. He treated them like obstacles to be managed. He forced them all to sit on the floor, using zip ties he had brought specifically for this purpose. This was the moment the FedEx facade was completely discarded. He revealed his true identity. He told them he was their Uncle Ronnie, a name that should have carried the weight of family and safety, but in this context, it felt like a curse. He began to question Cassidy about Melanie and the children, his children. He wanted to know where they were hidden. He was convinced that the Stays held the key to his property. Cassidy, despite the cold barrel of a gun and the terrifying transformation of her living room into a kill zone, refused to give him what he wanted. She remained focused on her siblings, trying to keep them calm even as the situation spiraled into the unthinkable. For nearly 30 minutes, the house was a theater of psychological torture. Haskell sat and waited, the grandfather clock in the hall marking the seconds toward the parents' arrival. He was patient. He talked to the children, his tone chillingly conversational as he explained that their parents had ruined his life and that he was there to settle the score. He didn't see the terror in their eyes. He saw the reflection of his own perceived victimhood. He was waiting for the architects of his misery to walk through the door so he could finish the job. Around 6 p.m., the sound of a car pulling into the driveway signaled the beginning of the end. Stephen and Katie Stay walked into their home, likely carrying bags of groceries or items for the children. They walked into a nightmare. They saw the man they had feared for years standing in their living room, their children bound and terrified on the floor. There was no time for negotiation, no room for the kindness they had always extended to others. Haskell immediately took control of the situation. He ordered Stephen and Katie to join the children on the floor. The air in the room grew thick with the realization of what was coming. Stephen tried to talk to him, tried to use the steady, pastoral voice that had comforted so many others. He pleaded for the lives of his children. He offered himself, his money, anything Ronald wanted. But Haskell wasn't interested in a trade. He was interested in an erasure. He told them all to lie face down on the floor. He wanted them in a line, a neat, orderly row of bodies. It was a request of staggering clinical coldness. He was organizing his work. One by one, they complied. The parents lay next to their children, their hands likely reaching out to touch one another in a final desperate act of connection. The house was quiet, save for the muffled sobs of the younger boys and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the killer. Haskell moved to the end of the line. He didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a final word or a moment of prayer. He began at the end, placing the barrel of the gun against the back of each head and pulling the trigger. The sound of the shots in that confined space must have been deafening, a series of sharp, final cracks that signaled the end of 6 lives. He moved with a mechanical rhythm. Stephen, then Katie, then the children. He was thorough. He wasn't firing wildly. He was executing. He shot Brian, then James, then little Rebecca. He didn't spare 4-year-old Zach, the boy who had done nothing but exist in a family Ronald hated. He worked his way down the line until he reached Cassidy. When the bullet struck Cassidy, it didn't take her life. In a miracle of physics and sheer willpower, the bullet grazed her skull, and she had the presence of mind to slump forward, closing her eyes and holding her breath. She played dead in a room filled with the metallic scent of blood and the echoing silence of her murdered family. She listened as Haskell walked through the house, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He wasn't finished. He went to the kitchen and took a drink of water, a detail of such mundane cruelty that it defies comprehension. He checked his phone. He prepared to leave, convinced that he had successfully cleansed the house of the people who had wronged him. As he walked out the door and returned to his van, he left behind a scene of absolute devastation. A family of 7 had been reduced to 1. The Avenger had completed his mission on Leaflet Lane, but he wasn't done with his list. He had more stops to make, more lives to settle. He started the engine and pulled away from the curb, his FedEx uniform still looking crisp and professional, his clipboard resting on the passenger seat. He drove away from the quiet cul-de-sac, leaving the stay home in a silence that would never truly be broken. But behind him, in the shadows of the living room, Cassidy Stay began to move. The one person he hadn't accounted for, the one survivor of his perfect execution, was about to ensure that his journey would end far differently than he planned. The silence that followed the departure of the white van was not a peaceful one. It was heavy, suffocating, and punctuated by the fading hum of an engine. In the living room of the house on Leaflet Lane, the unthinkable had occurred. A family had been methodically erased in a matter of minutes. But as Ronald Haskell drove away, believing he had left no witnesses behind, 15-year-old Cassidy Stay began the most harrowing struggle of her life. Despite a bullet wound to her head that had fractured her skull, the teenager waited until she was certain the delivery man was gone. With a level of composure that defies human logic, she didn't just scream for help. She acted with tactical precision. She knew that her Uncle Ronnie wasn't finished. He was heading for her grandparents' house to continue the massacre. Cassidy managed to reach a phone and dialed 911 at 6:12 p.m. Her voice, though trembling, was clear as she identified the shooter, described the white van, and warned the dispatcher of Haskell's next likely destination. It was this phone call that transformed a silent crime scene into a high-stakes manhunt. Within minutes, the suburban quiet of Spring, Texas, was shattered by the rhythmic wail of sirens. Local deputies arrived at the Stay residence to find a scene so horrific that many would later require counseling. They found 5 children and 2 adults shot in the back of the head, with only Cassidy clinging to life. While paramedics rushed Cassidy to a waiting helicopter, law enforcement moved with a singular, urgent purpose. Because of her detailed description, a deputy spotted the white van just a few miles away. The Avenger was no longer invisible. When the officer attempted a traffic stop, Haskell didn't pull over. He accelerated, leading police on a high-speed chase through narrow residential streets, weaving past school buses and commuters returning home. He was driving with the same cold desperation that had brought him to Texas, but the net was closing. The pursuit ended in a nearby cul-de-sac, a dead-end street that offered no escape. As Haskell realized he was trapped, he pulled his vehicle into the center of the road, surrounded by a phalanx of armored police vehicles and tactical teams. The transition from a delivery to a combat zone was instantaneous. For the residents of this quiet neighborhood, the evening news was unfolding in their front yards. Sharpshooters took positions on rooftops, and negotiators moved in, their voices amplified by bullhorns, echoing against the brick facades of suburban homes. For the next 3 hours, the world watched a televised standoff. Haskell remained inside the van, at one point holding a pistol to his own head, a gesture of ultimate cowardice after the calculated bravery he displayed against bound children. The negotiators attempted to draw him out, speaking to him about his family, his children, and the voices he would later claim directed his hand. But Haskell was unresponsive for long stretches, sitting in the driver's seat of the stolen van as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows over the asphalt. The atmosphere in the cul-de-sac was electric with tension. Police knew that he was armed and had already proven he had no bottom to his cruelty. They were prepared for a final shootout, but they also wanted him alive to face the justice he had tried to bypass. Finally, after hours of psychological maneuvering, the heat and the reality of his situation seemed to weigh on him. At approximately 10 p.m., Haskell opened the door. He didn't come out firing. He stepped out with his hands raised, his FedEx uniform now a symbol of his cowardice rather than his deception. He was taken into custody without a single further shot being fired. As he was led away in handcuffs, the scale of the tragedy began to ripple outward. The community of Spring was in a state of collective shock. Rumors of the FedEx shooter spread like wildfire, and the realization that the victims were the beloved Stay family sent a wave of grief through the neighborhood that would persist for years. While Haskell was being processed at the station, showing little to no remorse, the lights at the local church stayed on all night as neighbors gathered to pray for the one girl who had survived the storm. The manhunt was over, and the standoff had ended in a capture, but the true battle was only beginning. The investigators now had to piece together the how and why of a man who could travel 1,500 miles to execute his own nieces and nephews. They found the evidence of his meticulous planning, the zip ties, the extra ammunition, and the maps. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was a crime of logistics. As the news cameras packed up and the yellow tape was stretched around the house on Leaflet Lane, the reality settled in. A man in a uniform had knocked on a door, and a family had answered with the kindness that was their trademark, only to be met with a darkness that no amount of suburban light could ever fully dispel. The trial of Ronald Haskell, which reached its conclusion in late 2019 after years of legal maneuvering, was less a search for the perpetrator and more a clinical dissection of a killer's soul. There was no question of who had pulled the trigger, the physical evidence was overwhelming, and the testimony of the sole survivor was unshakable. Instead, the courtroom became a battlefield over the definition of responsibility. The defense leaned heavily on a performance of insanity, claiming that Haskell was a man lost in a fog of schizoaffective disorder driven by voices he could not ignore. They painted a picture of a man who was a passenger in his own body, a victim of a fractured mind who didn't understand that his actions were wrong. However, the prosecution systematically dismantled this narrative with FedEx precision. They argued that a man who hears voices doesn't meticulously steal a uniform, research drive times from California to Texas, and obtain a decoy package to bypass suburban security. They presented Ronald as a calculated predator who had weaponized his history of mental health issues to create a safety net for his crimes. The prosecution's case was built on the logic of his actions. He didn't fire wildly in a psychotic break. He ordered his victims to lie face down in a line to ensure he could execute them efficiently. His decision to wear a uniform was not the act of a madman, but of a strategist who knew that the stays were kind and would open their door to a stranger in a familiar outfit. The emotional core of the trial was the testimony of Cassidy Stay. Now a young woman, she walked into the courtroom with a poise that silenced the room. She looked directly at the man who had murdered her entire family and recounted the events of July 9th with a clarity that left no room for delusional interpretations. She described how he had waited for her parents, how he had spoken to the children, and how he had shown no hesitation as he moved down the line. Her presence was a living rebuke to Haskell's claims of being a victim of his own mind. In the end, the jury saw through the facade. It took them only hours to return a verdict of guilty on all counts of capital murder. The avenger, who had tried to hide behind a uniform and then behind a diagnosis, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial didn't just provide a legal resolution. It stripped away the last of Haskell's pretenses, revealing a man whose only true voices were those of entitlement and unadulterated rage. The house on Leaflet Lane eventually found new owners, but the story of the Stays remains etched into the spirit of Spring, Texas. Cassidy Stay, the girl who played dead to save her grandparents, became a symbol of unyielding resilience. She transformed her unimaginable grief into a message of hope, famously quoting Harry Potter at a memorial. Happiness can be found even in the darkest of times, if one only remembers to turn on the light. While Ronald Haskell rots in a cell, defined by his cowardice, the Stays are remembered for their warmth. Cassidy's voice remains, a living testament that light, once kindled, cannot be extinguished by even the darkest shadow. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. The air in the Barhaven suburb of Ottawa usually carries the scent of fresh pine and wood smoke from backyard fire pits, a quiet, predictable fragrance that matches the rhythm of the middle-class families living there. But on the night of March 6, 2024, the stillness of Berrigan Drive was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in this manicured landscape. It was a rhythmic, frantic pounding on a neighbor's door, followed by a voice that was barely human, thick with blood and the kind of raw, primal terror that leaves a permanent scar on the memory of anyone who hears it. When the first patrol cars pulled onto the street, their tires crunched over a light dusting of late winter snow. The blue and red lights reflected off the dark windows of the rows of identical suburban homes, giving the neighborhood a surreal, flickering glow. Officers stepped out into the biting cold, expecting a standard domestic dispute, but as they approached the Wickramasinghe residence, the atmosphere shifted. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy and suffocating. Inside, the sensory details were enough to break even the most seasoned investigators. The metallic, cloying smell of copper hung thick in the warm air of the hallway. There was no sound of a struggle, no shouting, only the soft, mechanical hum of the refrigerator and the distant, haunting chime of a child's toy that had been left on. In the shadows of the living area, the reality of the scene began to reveal itself. It wasn't just a crime, it was an erasure. The sight of small, motionless figures against the backdrop of a normal family home created a cognitive dissonance that made the officers' breath hitch in their chests. This was the moment the peace of Barrhaven died, replaced by a darkness that had been living quietly in the guest room. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the weight of the silence that now haunts Berrigan Drive, one must first look back at the vibrant, noisy, and hopeful life that filled the Wickramasinghe home just months prior. Like thousands of families before them, Danushka Wickramasinghe and his wife, Darshani Ekanyake, saw Canada not just as a map of vast distances and cold winters, but as a blueprint for their children's futures. They were part of a growing Sri Lankan diaspora, a community built on the pillars of education, hard work, and an unshakable belief that the safety of a Canadian suburb was the ultimate prize for years of sacrifice. The move to Barrhaven, a rapidly expanding community in Ottawa's southwest end, was a milestone. In neighborhoods like this, the houses are built with large windows and open-concept kitchens, designed for families who want to be seen as successful and settled. For Danushka and Darshani, this house was their sanctuary. It was a place where the air was thick with the scent of Sri Lankan spices, turmeric, cumin, and roasted curry powder, mixing with the mundane smells of a Canadian household. The walls were decorated with the colorful, chaotic artwork of children and the framed milestones of a family on the rise. Darshani was the heart of this domestic world. Friends described her as a woman of immense warmth, someone whose energy was entirely focused on the 4 lives she had brought into the world. Her days were a blur of school runs, meal prep, and the exhausting but rewarding labor of raising 4 children in a foreign land. She was the steady hand that kept the household moving, even as her husband worked long hours to provide for them. Danushka was a man of quiet ambition, a father who viewed every hour of overtime as a brick in the foundation of his children's lives. He was well regarded in the local community, known for his willingness to help other newcomers find their footing, much like he and Darshani once had to do. Then there were the children, the reason for every sacrifice. 7-year-old Inuka, the eldest, was a bright boy with an easy smile, already navigating the dualities of being a Sri Lankan Canadian. He was followed by his sisters, 4-year-old Ashwini and 2-year-old Rinyana. The house was a constant theater of their laughter, their minor squabbles over toys, and the rhythmic thumping of feet running across the hardwood floors. The newest addition, little Kelly, was only 2 months old, a tiny, fragile symbol of the family's continued growth and hope. In those early months of 2024, the Wickramasinghe home was a place of new baby smells and the soft, tired joy of parents who were exactly where they wanted to be. But the house wasn't just occupied by the Wickramasinghes. There was also Amarakun Mubiayansela Gegamini Amarakun, a 40-year-old family friend. He was another thread in the tapestry of the Sri Lankan immigrant experience, a man seeking his own path in a new country, finding temporary shelter and companionship with a family that treated him as one of their own. He was a familiar face at the dinner table, a helping hand, and a witness to the family's daily triumphs. Life in Barrhaven felt shielded. In this part of Ottawa, the biggest concerns for residents were usually the timing of snow removal or the construction of new transit lines. It was the kind of place where parents felt comfortable letting their children play in the backyard as the sun dipped below the horizon, where neighbors knew the names of each other's dogs, and where the concept of mass murder was something that happened in movies or far-off cities. The Wickramasinghes had done everything right. They had followed the rules, built a life through honest labor, and surrounded themselves with a community of peers. Darshani often shared updates with her family back in Sri Lanka, sending photos of the children bundled in colorful winter gear, their faces pink from the Ottawa cold. To those back home, they were the success story, the family that made it to the Great White North and thrived. They were building a bridge between two worlds, ensuring that while their children grew up with Canadian accents and an affinity for hockey, they would never forget the roots that stretched across the ocean to the island of Sri Lanka. However, beneath this veneer of suburban perfection, a new element had been introduced into the household. A quiet, 19-year-old student named Febrio de Zoysa. He was a guest in their home, a fellow countryman who they had welcomed with the same hospitality they extended to everyone. At the time, his presence seemed like a minor footnote in their busy lives. He was just a young man looking for a place to stay while he pursued his studies, a quiet figure who kept mostly to himself in the guest room. As winter began to lose its grip on the city and the family looked forward to the first hints of spring, there was no indication that the sanctuary they had built was under threat. There were no loud arguments heard by neighbors, no police calls for domestic disturbances, and no red flags that suggested the young man in the guest room was anything other than a typical, perhaps slightly homesick, international student. The Wickramasinghes were living their dream, unaware that the deadliest mass killing in the history of modern Ottawa was not a random act of street violence, but a darkness that had already been invited through their front door and given a place to sleep. The stage was set for a tragedy that would not only destroy a family, but would force an entire nation to look at the vulnerabilities of its international student community and the hidden tensions that can simmer in the quietest of suburbs. To the neighbors on Berrigan Drive, Febrio de Zoysa was a ghost, a shadow that occasionally moved behind the glass of the Wickramasinghe home. At 19 years old, he was at an age defined by transition, a period where the bridge between childhood and the heavy responsibilities of adulthood is often fraught with internal turmoil. He had come to Canada from Sri Lanka as an international student, carrying the immense, often crushing expectations that come with such a journey. In his home country, sending a child to study in a Western nation like Canada is viewed as a monumental investment, a gamble involving the family's life savings and their collective hope for a better lineage. Febrio had enrolled at Algonquin College, a prominent institution in Ottawa known for its diverse international student body. However, as the winter of 2024 deepened, his connection to his studies began to fray. Reports from the college would later suggest that he had stopped attending classes, a common red flag in the life of an international student that often signals a descent into isolation or a crisis of identity. When a student stops going to class in a foreign country, the walls of their world begin to shrink rapidly. The bustling campus, the shared lectures, and the social promise of university life evaporate, leaving behind a sterile existence confined to four walls and the blue light of a laptop screen. The Wickramasinghes, known for their boundless hospitality and deep roots in the local Sri Lankan community, had welcomed Febrio into their home during this period. It was a common arrangement, host families providing a room, home-cooked meals, and a sense of cultural familiarity to students who might otherwise be lost in the vast, cold expanse of the Canadian landscape. For Febrio, the house in Barhaven offered more than just a bed. It offered a surrogate family. He was invited to sit at their table, to share in the turmeric-stained warmth of their dinners, and to witness the chaotic, joyful upbringing of their four children. Danushka and Darshani didn't see a threat when they looked at the quiet teenager. They saw a fellow countryman, perhaps one struggling with the biting wind of his first real winter or the heavy silence of homesickness. They treated him with a kindness that, in retrospect, feels agonizingly misplaced. He was given the guest room, a space that became his private fortress. While the rest of the house hummed with the sounds of a 2-month-old infant's cries and the laughter of toddlers, Febrio remained largely withdrawn. The dynamics of a host-family relationship are built on a delicate foundation of trust. The family opens their most private sanctuary to a stranger, and in return, the guest is expected to respect the boundaries of that home. For several months, Febrio seemed to adhere to this silent contract. He was described as extraordinarily quiet, a young man who kept his head down and his voice low. But this silence was not necessarily a sign of peace. To a trained observer, such total withdrawal can be a mask for a growing internal pressure, a slow-motion psychological collapse that goes unnoticed because it doesn't make a sound. Behind the closed door of the guest room, Febrio's digital life likely became his only reality. For many international students, the pressure to succeed is compounded by a profound sense of face. To admit failure, to tell parents back in Sri Lanka that the classes are too hard or that the loneliness is too much, is often seen as an impossibility. This creates a pressure cooker of the mind. As he stopped attending Algonquin College, the discrepancy between his reality and the image he had to project back home must have become a source of immense psychological friction. There were subtle shifts, small tremors before the earthquake. Danushka would later recall that Febrio's behavior had become increasingly erratic in the days leading up to the incident. He was spending more time in total isolation, his interactions with the family becoming clipped and hollow. Yet, in a busy household with 4 children under the age of 7, including a newborn, these signs are easily dismissed as the moods of a typical, brooding teenager. There was no history of violence, no criminal record, and no overt threats. He was simply a quiet student, a descriptor that would later become a haunting refrain in the media. The presence of Gamini Amarakun in the house added another layer to the domestic tapestry. Gamini, also from Sri Lanka, was a friend who had recently arrived and was staying with the family while he found his footing. He and Febrio were the 2 outliers in the nuclear family unit, the student and the friend. They shared the same space, the same meals, and the same cultural background, but they were headed toward 2 very different fates. As the calendar turned to March, the atmosphere inside the house began to thicken with an unspoken tension. The slow burn of Febrio's psychological state was reaching a critical mass. He was a young man who had lost his tether to his education, his purpose, and perhaps his grip on the social reality surrounding him. He was living in the heart of a perfect family, a constant witness to a level of domestic success and happiness that he might have felt was moving further and further out of his own reach. The tragedy of the Barhaven mass murder is not just in the violence itself, but in the months of normalcy that preceded it. It is the horror of the mundane, the idea that you can share bread with someone, watch them interact with your children, and offer them the safety of your roof, while they are quietly calculating your end. Febrio de Zoysa was not an intruder who broke in through a basement window in the dead of night. He was the young man who had been given a key. He was the one who knew the layout of the bedrooms, the creaks in the floorboards, and the vulnerability of a family that believed the greatest danger in Ottawa was the winter cold. As the sun set on March 6, 2024, the Wickramasinghe family went through their usual evening routines. Diapers were changed, stories were read, and the 2-month-old Kelly was settled into her bassinet. Gamini and the parents likely exchanged quiet conversation before retiring. In the guest room, Febrio de Zoysa sat in a silence that was about to explode. The quiet student, the ghost in the guest room, was no longer just a struggling teenager. He had become a predator in the sanctuary, waiting for the house to fall into the deep, unsuspecting sleep of the suburban midnight. The transition from a peaceful suburban evening to a nightmare began in the early hours of March 6, 2024. In the Wickramasinghe household, the rhythms of the night were typically dictated by the needs of an infant. Little Kelly, just 2 months old, was the center of a fragile ecosystem of sleep and care. By midnight, the house on Berrigan Drive had settled into that profound, heavy silence common to neighborhoods where the streetlights are the only things moving. The temperature outside hovered near freezing, and the world was tucked away behind double-paned glass and locked doors. Inside the residence, the family was spread across the bedrooms. Danushka and Darshani were likely resting, perhaps drifting into the deep sleep of exhausted parents. The children, 7-year-old Inuka, 4-year-old Ashwini and 2-year-old Rinyana were tucked into their beds, surrounded by the colorful comforts of childhood. In another room, the family's friend, 40-year-old Gamini Amarakun, was also asleep, unaware that his journey from Sri Lanka would reach such a sudden and violent conclusion. And in the guest room, Febrio de Zoysa remained in the shadows, a 19-year-old who had lived under their roof for months, eating their food and witnessing their kindness. The violence did not begin with a shout or a warning. It began with the cold, calculated movement of a predator who already knew the layout of the home. Febrio de Zoysa did not need to break in. He was already inside the sanctuary. Armed with a sharp object, he began a systematic attack that targeted the most vulnerable members of the household first. There was no robbery gone wrong, no sign of forced entry, and no heated argument that preceded the slaughter. It was a concentrated explosion of irrational, unprovoked rage directed at the very people who had provided him with a home. One by one, the lives of the children were extinguished. The silence of the night was likely punctuated only by the soft thuds of a struggle or the stifled sounds of those unable to comprehend the betrayal occurring in their own bedrooms. Darshani, the mother who had spent her every waking hour protecting and nurturing these 4 lives, was unable to save them. She, too, became a target of the relentless assault. The youngest victim, little Kelly, who had only seen 2 months of the world, was not spared. The innocence of the scene, a baby's bassinet, the smell of milk and laundry detergent, was replaced by a visceral, metallic horror as the life was drained from the room. Gamini Amarakun, the family friend who had likely felt safe in the company of his compatriots, was the next to fall. He was found with fatal injuries, a witness who was silenced before he could intervene. The perpetrator moved through the house with a terrifying efficiency, utilizing his knowledge of the family's habits to ensure that no one could escape or call for help until it was far too long after the first blow had landed. Dhanushka Wickramasinghe, the father and the provider, found himself in a desperate, primal battle for survival. Unlike the others, who may have been taken entirely by surprise in their sleep, Dhanushka managed to confront the attacker. The struggle was brutal. Dhanushka sustained severe injuries, including deep lacerations to his face and hands as he tried to fend off the person he had once considered a guest in his home. In the chaos of the kitchen and the hallways, the sensory details were overwhelming. The frantic gasps for air, the slickness of the floors, and the realization that the world he had built was collapsing in real time. Somehow, through a combination of adrenaline and sheer willpower, the wounded father managed to escape the house. He staggered out into the biting Ottawa night, his breath coming in ragged plumes of white mist. He reached a neighbor's door, his hands leaving crimson smears on the siding as he pounded for help. His voice, hoarse and thick with trauma, alerted the quiet street that something unthinkable had occurred inside the brick walls of his home. The first responders who arrived minutes later were greeted by a scene that defied suburban logic. The father, bleeding and in shock, could only point back toward the house. When police entered, they found Febrio de Zoysa still at the scene. He was taken into custody without further violence, a 19-year-old student who had just committed the deadliest mass killing in the city's modern history. He was found in a state that investigators would later struggle to describe, quiet, perhaps detached, as if the gravity of the erasure he had performed had not yet fully permeated his psyche. As the paramedics rushed Dhanushka to the hospital, the investigators began the grim task of documenting the loss. They moved through the house with flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness to reveal the remains of a family. The sight of the children, motionless in their pajamas, was a psychological blow to the officers that would necessitate long-term counseling. There was no rhyme or reason to be found in the bloodstains on the hardwood or the discarded toys that lay near the bodies. The sanctuary had been turned into a tomb. The slow burn of the investigation would eventually reveal the technicalities of the crime, but for those inside the house that night, it was a fast, blinding descent into hell. The betrayal was absolute. In true crime history, many killers are strangers who strike from the shadows, but Febrio de Zoysa was a face at the breakfast table. He was the one who had seen the children play, who had likely been thanked by Darshani for minor chores, and who had been trusted with the key to their safety. The tragedy in Barrhaven on that night was not just the loss of 6 lives, but the destruction of the very concept of the safe harbor that Canada represents to many. The Wickramasinghes had traveled thousands of miles to find peace, only to find that the greatest threat was the one they had kindly invited to stay in their guest room. As the sun began to rise on March 7th, the residents of Berrigan Drive woke up to a world that was fundamentally different. The yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the wind was a stark, ugly contrast to the white snow, marking the boundary where a family's dreams had been systematically dismantled by a quiet student with a hidden darkness. In the days that followed, the details of the attack would emerge in fragments, each one more heartbreaking than the last. The sheer number of victims, 4 children under the age of 7, made the incident a national tragedy. The survival of the father, while a miracle of physical endurance, was its own kind of tragedy, as he was left to navigate a world where his entire family had been taken in a single, senseless hour. The night the world ended for the Wickramasinghes would forever remain a dark anchor in the history of Ottawa, a reminder of the fragility of trust and the capacity for unimaginable violence to dwell in the most mundane of places. The immediate aftermath of the tragedy on Berrigan Drive was a blur of high-stakes medical intervention and a somber, systematic search for clarity. As the red and blue lights of emergency vehicles continued to pulse against the suburban brickwork, Danushka Wickramasinghe was rushed into surgery, his body a map of the desperate struggle he had just endured. He had sustained severe injuries to his hands and face while attempting to protect his family from the person they had welcomed as a guest. While surgeons worked to repair the physical damage, the psychological weight of the night began to settle over the city of Ottawa. The search for a motive began the moment Febrio de Zoysa was taken into custody at the scene. Officers, still reeling from the visual horror of the interior, cordoned off the entire street, their breath visible in the cold March air as they began the tedious process of collecting evidence. The slow burn of forensic investigation meant that every bloodstain, every discarded object, and every digital footprint left behind by the quiet student had to be catalogued. They were looking for the trigger, the moment a 19-year-old international student transformed into a mass killer. In the hospital, Danushka's survival was nothing short of a miracle, yet it was a victory hollowed out by loss. When he finally regained consciousness, the news he received was a secondary trauma that no physical wound could rival. He learned that his wife, Darshani, and his 4 children, Inuka, Ashwini, Rinyana, and little Kelly, were gone. He learned that his friend, Gamini Amarakun, had also perished. The man who had spent years building a sanctuary in Canada was now the sole witness to its total destruction. The community's reaction was swift and visceral. As the names and ages of the victims were released to the public, a wave of collective grief washed over the Sri Lankan diaspora and the wider Canadian public. The detail that Kelly, the youngest victim, was only 2 months old became a focal point of the tragedy, a symbol of the absolute senselessness of the violence. People began to gather near the yellow police tape, leaving bouquets of flowers, stuffed animals, and candles that flickered against the snow. It was a social echo of a town trying to reclaim its sense of peace. While Danushka fought for his physical recovery, the police were conducting a different kind of search, a search through the perpetrator's history. They reached out to the Sri Lankan High Commission and Algonquin College, trying to piece together the fragments of Febrio de Zoysa's life in Canada. The investigation revealed that the teenager had moved to Canada with the weight of his family's expectations, but he had recently stopped attending his classes. This descent into isolation was a common thread in student tragedies, but it rarely culminated in such a catastrophic explosion of violence. The red herrings of the initial investigation included theories of outside intruders or a pre-planned conspiracy, but the evidence pointed relentlessly back to the young man in the guest room. There were no signs of forced entry. The security system, which the family only occasionally armed, had captured nothing of an external threat. The threat was internal. It was a person who knew the creak of the floorboards and the rhythm of the family's sleep. The survivors of the community, the neighbors who heard the pounding on the door, described an atmosphere of lingering fear. For weeks, the quiet streets of Barhaven felt different. The sight of the Wickramasinghe house, silent and dark behind the police tape, served as a grim reminder that the ideal family life could be dismantled in a single night. Rumors swirled about the perpetrator's mental state, but the lack of a clear, logical motive only increased the local anxiety. Danushka's journey from the hospital bed back into the world was marked by an extraordinary display of grace. Despite his immense suffering, he expressed gratitude for the outpouring of support from the community. He became the face of a tragedy that most people could only imagine in their worst nightmares. His presence at the vigils, bandaged and broken but standing, was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of absolute betrayal. He was no longer just a father or a husband. He was the living memory of a family that had been erased. As the investigation transitioned from the crime scene to the legal preparation for trial, the focus shifted to the why. Detectives and psychologists began to look at the pressures of the international student experience, the isolation, the cultural disconnect, and the fear of failure that can warp a young mind. However, even as they gathered digital evidence and interviewed those who knew him, the ultimate reason for the attack remained elusive, hidden behind the quiet, stoic mask of the 19-year-old in the orange jumpsuit. This period of the search was characterized by a heavy, somber realization that while the physical evidence was clear, the psychological motive might never be fully understood. The community was left to mourn 6 lives taken by a person who had been offered nothing but kindness. The survival of Danushka Wickramasinghe ensured that the story of his family would not be forgotten, but it also meant he would have to carry the burden of the night the world ended for the rest of his life. The silence that followed the arrest of Fabio de Zoysa was perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire investigation. In the wake of the deadliest mass killing in Ottawa's history, detectives were left with a mountain of forensic evidence, but a total void where a motive should have been. The slow burn of the interrogation process revealed a suspect who was chillingly composed, a 19-year-old who had systematically dismantled a family but offered no immediate explanation for the carnage. Investigators began a deep dive into de Zoysa's digital and social history, attempting to find the fracture point where a quiet international student became a mass murderer. The search for the why led detectives back to Algonquin College. They interviewed classmates and faculty, looking for any sign of a grievance or a sudden change in demeanor. What they found was a pattern of profound withdrawal. De Zoysa had effectively vanished from the campus weeks before the attack. This isolation is a common theme in such tragedies. A young person, separated from their support system in a foreign country, begins to lose their grip on the social and moral anchors of reality. Without the daily structure of classes or social interaction, the mind can become a fertile ground for dark, obsessive thoughts. However, even with this context, the leap from academic struggle to the slaughter of a 2-month-old infant remained a chasm that the police struggled to bridge. Every piece of the puzzle was examined. Detectives looked into his financial records, his communications with family back in Sri Lanka, and his browsing history. They were searching for a trigger, a specific event like an eviction notice, a failed grade, or a rejected romantic overture. Yet the Wickramasinghe family had been nothing but supportive. They hadn't threatened to kick him out. In fact, they had treated him like a younger brother or an eldest son. This lack of external conflict made the betrayal even more staggering. The community began to wonder if the motive was purely internal, a psychological collapse that manifested as a nihilistic rage against the very concept of the happy, successful life the Wickramasinghes represented. The investigation also touched on the social atmosphere of the international student community. Many students shared stories of the immense pressure to succeed and the shame of failing their families back home. The detectives considered whether de Zoysa viewed the Wickramasinghes not as benefactors, but as a constant, painful reminder of the success he was failing to achieve. To sit at a table with a man who had built a life through hard work, while your own dreams were evaporating, might have created a toxic level of resentment. This theory of comparative failure became a central focus as the police tried to build a psychological profile of the suspect. During this phase, the police had to navigate a landscape of red herrings. There were early rumors of a third party involved or a potential link to organized crime back in Sri Lanka, but these were quickly dismissed. The forensic evidence was surgical in its precision. The attack was carried out by one person using a knife, and that person was Febrio de Zoysa. There were no signs of a struggle from anyone outside the home. The security system in the Barhaven suburb, which captured neighbors' cars and the occasional nocturnal animal, showed no one entering or leaving the house in the hours surrounding the crime, except for the wounded Danushka staggering toward a neighbor's porch. The community's fear was palpable during this time. Rumors of a hit list or other potential targets circulated through the Sri Lankan diaspora, forcing the police to hold several press conferences to reassure the public that this was an isolated, albeit horrific, incident. The local atmosphere in Barhaven changed. People who had previously left their doors unlocked began to double-check their deadbolts. The trust that had defined the neighborhood was replaced by a wary vigilance. The social echo of the crime was a realization that the greatest dangers aren't always strangers in the street, but can sometimes be the person you've invited to share your dinner. As the detectives finalized their report for the Crown, the frustration of the missing motive lingered. They had the how, a systematic, brutal attack, and they had the who, but the why remained a jagged, unsatisfying piece of the story. They analyzed de Zoysa's laptop, finding evidence of a young man who had become obsessed with dark themes and perhaps felt a sense of alienation that had curdled into something far more dangerous. Yet, there was no manifesto, no final note, and no clear explanation for why the children had to die. Danushka Wickramasinghe, still recovering from his physical wounds, provided what information he could. He spoke of the quiet student who had lived with them for months. He recounted the mundane interactions, the shared meals, the brief conversations about the weather or school. There had been no warning, no threats, no red flags that would have allowed a reasonable person to predict such a catastrophic event. This total lack of a precursor is what made the Barhaven mass murder so terrifying to the general public. It suggested that such a darkness could exist in anyone, hidden behind a mask of normalcy until it was too late. The investigation ultimately painted a portrait of a young man who had lost his way in a foreign land, and instead of seeking help, turned his internal turmoil outward upon the only people who were trying to help him. The tragedy was a perfect storm of isolation, perceived failure, and a hidden psychological instability that reached a breaking point on a quiet Wednesday night. By the time the case was ready for trial, the investigators knew they had done everything they could to document the crime, but they also knew that some questions would never have answers that made sense to a sane mind. The legal road to justice for the Wickramasinghe family culminated in November 2025, bringing a formal end to a case that had paralyzed Ottawa with grief. Febrio de Zoysa, who had remained mostly silent since his arrest at the scene, faced the full weight of the Canadian justice system. Throughout the proceedings, the court heard the agonizing details of the night, but the focus remained on the surviving father, Danushka. In a courtroom filled with heavy silence, Danushka's victim impact statement served as the emotional epicenter of the trial. He spoke not of vengeance, but of the hollow world he now inhabited, a world where the laughter of his 4 children and the warmth of his wife had been replaced by the sterile quiet of a survivor's life. The court ultimately finalized a sentence of life imprisonment for de Zoysa. While the defense touched upon the isolation and mental strain of an international student's life, the sheer scale of the massacre, 6 lives, including an infant, left no room for leniency. The judge's final remarks echoed the sentiments of a nation, labeling the acts as a betrayal of the highest order. By November 2025, the legal chapter was closed, but for the community of Barhaven and the sole survivor, the verdict was merely a landmark on a lifelong journey of healing. Justice was served in the eyes of the law, but it could never restore the sanctuary that had been destroyed on Berrigan Drive. The house on Berrigan Drive stands as a silent monument to a dream that was systematically dismantled from within. In the quiet of the Barhaven night, the shadows no longer whisper of progress or new beginnings, but of a sanctuary that failed. Danushka Wickramasinghe remains, a man who survived the unthinkable to ensure his family's names are spoken with love rather than just tragedy. The city of Ottawa has moved on, yet the scars remain. A reminder that trust is a fragile thing, and sometimes the most profound darkness is the one we kindly invite through our own front door. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. Ottawa, May 2012. The sun is pale over the capital, but inside the Conservative Party headquarters, the air has turned heavy, metallic. A receptionist reaches for a package, a vibrant red envelope that stands out against the sterile morning mail. As the seal breaks, the stench hits first, cloying, ancient, wrong. Inside, nestled in tissue, is a severed human foot, its skin a waxy porcelain white. This wasn't just a murder, it was an opening night. The first scene in a script written by a man who refused to die in obscurity. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the monster that the world would eventually come to know, one must first look at the mannequin, the hollow shell of a man named Eric Clinton Kirk Newman. He was born on July 24, 1982, in Scarborough, Ontario, a suburb of Toronto that felt, to him, like a vast gray prison. From the very beginning, his reality was a fragile thing, constructed not from genuine human connection, but from the flickering images of television screens and the desperate, hushed whispers of a deeply fractured home. His mother, Anna Yorkin, would later describe a household defined by isolation. Eric was homeschooled, a decision that kept him away from the sharpening stones of social interaction during his most formative years. His father, Donald Newman, struggled with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, a presence in the home that introduced a jagged edge of unpredictability to Eric's childhood. In this environment, the young boy didn't learn how to navigate the complexities of friendship or empathy. Instead, he learned how to retreat into fantasies. He spent hours in front of the mirror, practicing expressions, mimicking the charismatic villains of Hollywood, and convincing himself that the world outside was merely a stage waiting for its lead actor, and he was the only one fit for the role. By the time he reached his late teens, the name Eric Newman felt like a lead weight. It was common, unremarkable, and stained with the memories of a boy who was never quite enough. He began a slow, deliberate process of shedding his identity, like a snake discarding a dull skin for something more vibrant, more lethal. He moved to Toronto, a city he believed would finally recognize his brilliance, but the reality was a cold shower. The modeling agencies didn't want him. The mainstream film industry didn't even notice him. To the world, he was just another face in the crowd, another dreamer working odd jobs to pay for a cramped apartment. This rejection didn't lead to self-reflection. It led to a simmering, narcissistic rage. If the world wouldn't give him fame, he would manufacture it. He turned to the adult film industry, not out of passion, but because it was a lens that would finally point in his direction. Under various pseudonyms, Vladimir Romanov, Mattia del Santo, he performed for the camera, but even there, he remained a bit player. He was a man who craved the kind of adoration reserved for A-list celebrities, yet he lacked the talent to earn it. In 2006, he took the final step in his self-creation, legally changing his name to Luca Rocco Magnotta. He chose the name for its rhythmic European flair. It sounded like a name people would remember. It was the name of a star. But a name wasn't enough. He needed a history to match. He began to flood the early internet with a digital trail of lies. He created over 70 different Facebook pages and hundreds of accounts on various forums, all dedicated to one subject: himself. Using these sock puppet accounts, he would post rumors about his own life, claiming he was a world-famous model, that he was dating notorious criminals like the child killer Karla Homolka, or that he was a victim of a vast international conspiracy. He would spend his nights in internet cafes, logged into multiple windows, having conversations with himself. One account would praise Luca's beauty, while another would pretend to be a hater, sparking controversy that he hoped would catch the eye of the media. He was obsessed with the idea of being viral long before the term was common. He was curating a digital museum of a life he wasn't actually living, uploading photos of luxury cars he had never driven and standing in front of high-end apartments he could never afford. This wasn't just vanity, it was a pathology. Luca Magnotta was a man who didn't exist unless someone was watching. His physical body was merely a vessel for the persona. He began to undergo a series of plastic surgeries, a nose job, hair transplants, lip fillers, all in an attempt to look like a generic, polished version of a Hollywood star. He wanted to look like the men he saw in movies like Basic Instinct or American Psycho, men who were beautiful, cold, and powerful. He became a nomad, drifting between Toronto, Los Angeles, and Europe, always one step ahead of the debt collectors and the truth. Every time a city grew tired of his act, he would simply pack his bags and reinvent himself elsewhere. But as the years ticked by and he approached his 30s, the desperation began to turn into a dark, curdling rot. The fake fame wasn't enough anymore. The likes and comments from his own ghost accounts were hollow. He realized that the world didn't care about a mediocre model or a pathological liar. But the world always noticed a monster. He began to study the mechanics of notoriety. He realized that the greatest stars weren't just the ones who were loved, they were the ones who were feared. He started to watch the way the internet reacted to cruelty. He saw how a single disturbing video could travel further and faster than 1,000 beautiful photographs. The script was changing. He was no longer interested in being the romantic lead. He was ready to embrace the role of the villain, the kind of villain that would force the world to look at him, even if they had to scream while doing it. He started small, testing the waters of public outrage. He began to film himself in situations that would make any sane person recoil, documenting the suffering of the most vulnerable creatures he could find. He wasn't just committing acts of cruelty, he was directing them. He would set up the lighting, choose the music, and ensure the camera angle was perfect. He was a director of horrors, and the internet was about to become his first unwitting audience. The man who had spent his life begging for a glance was about to ensure that no one who saw his work would ever be able to look away. His digital footprint became a labyrinth of breadcrumbs, a deliberate challenge to the keyboard warriors he knew were watching. He thrived on the attention of the very people who sought to stop him. To Luca, there was no such thing as bad press. There was only the spotlight, and he was willing to burn down the entire world just to stay in its warmth for a few more minutes. The transition from Eric Newman to Luca Magnotta was complete. The mask was on, the stage was set, and the first act of his masterpiece was about to begin. The year was 2010, and while the rest of the world was beginning to embrace the connective power of social media for shared memories and viral dances, a darker corner of the internet was already being colonized by a different kind of content. On a niche gore website, the kind of place where the curious and the depraved meet to witness what the mainstream media refuses to show, a video appeared. It was titled with a simplicity that belied its horror: One Boy, Two Kittens. The video was low resolution, grainy, and claustrophobic. It showed a small, sterile room. A man, his face carefully obscured, dressed in a purple hoodie, stood over a bed covered with a distinct sunflower yellow comforter. On that bed were two helpless kittens. The man didn't just hurt them, he used a vacuum sealer, a kitchen appliance meant for preserving food, to slowly and methodically extinguish their lives. He didn't just want to commit the act, he wanted to record it, he wanted to edit it, he wanted to release it. The reaction was instantaneous, not from the authorities, who at the time viewed animal cruelty on the internet as a low-priority nuisance, but from a loosely knit collective of ordinary citizens. This was the birth of the internet sleuth, a breed of digital detective fueled by a mixture of righteous indignation and obsessive curiosity. In a Facebook group titled "Facebook Detectives Catch a Cat Killer," two individuals emerged as the leaders of the hunt: Deanna Thompson, who went by the online handle Bowdy Movin', and John Green. They didn't have badges, and they didn't have warrants. What they had was time, and an infinite capacity for frame-by-frame analysis. They began to dissect the video like a digital autopsy. Every shadow, every reflection, every muffled sound was a potential lead. They weren't just looking for a person, they were looking for a location. The vacuum sealer became a focal point, They identified the specific model, a Miele vacuum cleaner, and tracked its distribution. They looked at the electrical outlets visible for a split second behind the bed, concluding they were North American, not European. They looked at the cigarette brand on the nightstand. They even analyzed the way the man moved, his gait, the length of his fingers, the way he carried himself with a strange, theatrical stiffness. But as the sleuths dug deeper, they realized they weren't the only ones playing the game. The killer was watching them. Luca Magnotta, though he hadn't been officially identified yet, was a member of the very groups dedicated to catching him. He was feeding on the outrage. He would post comments under various aliases, mocking the detectives, leading them down false trails, and then laughing as they hit dead ends. He would create tribute pages to himself, pretending to be a fan of the vacuum-sealing boy, just to see the reaction of the normies who were horrified by his work. To the sleuths, it was a race against time. To Luca, it was the greatest performance of his life. He was finally the lead actor in a drama that captivated thousands of people. He was the John Doe of the digital underground. He loved the villain moniker. He thrived on the idea that people were losing sleep, scouring the globe just to find out his name. The escalation was predictable to those who understood the narcissistic mind, but invisible to the police. In 2011, a second video surfaced, Python Christmas. It was more elaborate, more produced. It showed a kitten being fed to a large snake. Again, the outrage spiked. Again, the sleuths warned that this was a man who was practicing, a man who was desensitizing himself to the act of killing, moving from small mammals to something larger. Deanna Thompson and her team eventually found him. They connected the digital trail, the hundreds of fake accounts, the modeling photos, the Vladimir Romanov personas, to a single man living in Toronto. They found his address. They found his name. Luca, emboldened by the authorities' lack of interest, began to taunt his pursuers more openly. He sent emails to the group, claiming that once you kill, you get a taste for it, and hinting that his next project would be something the world would never forget. He was no longer hiding his identity. He was branding it. He wanted the sleuths to know it was him. He wanted them to feel the helplessness of knowing what was coming and being unable to stop it. He moved to Montreal, seeking the anonymity of a larger French-speaking city. He rented a small, nondescript apartment on Descaries Boulevard, a place that looked like 1,000 other bachelor units. But inside, he was turning it into a movie set. He was buying equipment. He was scouted for co-stars on Craigslist and dating sites. He was looking for someone who wouldn't be missed, someone who could serve as the final prop in his bid for eternal fame. The atmosphere in the online groups turned from determination to dread. The prelude was over. The sleuths had done their job. They had identified the killer before he killed, but the system had failed to act. Luca was now a man with nothing to lose and a script that required a climax. He was spending his days in Montreal's gay village, drifting through bars, presenting himself as a quiet, somewhat eccentric young man. He was charming when he needed to be, invisible when he didn't. He was waiting for the right person to cross his path, someone who didn't know about the vacuum sealer, someone who didn't know about the sunflower blanket, someone who would walk into his apartment thinking they were meeting a date, only to find themselves cast in the lead role of a nightmare. The digital trail of cruelty had led to a physical doorstep in Montreal. The cameras were ready. The lighting was set. Luca Magnotta was about to take his final bow as an internet curiosity and step into the blinding, horrific light of international infamy. The sleuths could only watch their screens and wait for the notification that would confirm their worst fears. The script was moving into its final blood-soaked act, and there was no one left to call for a cut. The man in 208, Luca Magnotta, is no longer the drifting model or the internet ghost of years past. He has spent the last several weeks preparing. The apartment is small, scarcely 400 square feet, rented for less than $500 a month. It is a space of utilitarian misery, yet Luca has curated it with the precision of a movie set. On the wall hangs a poster for the film Casablanca, Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, icons of a vanished Hollywood glamour, staring down at a stained mattress and a stack of plastic containers. It is a jarring juxtaposition, the height of romantic cinema overlooking a room destined for the depths of human depravity. While Luca waits, a world away from the celebrity life he invented, a 33-year-old man named Jun Lin is finishing his day. Jun Lin is, in every way, the antithesis of the man waiting in apartment 208. He is a student at Concordia University, pursuing a degree in engineering and computer science. He is a son, a brother, and a beloved friend who moved from Wuhan, China, to Montreal in search of a better life, a life built on hard work and genuine achievement rather than digital illusions. He works part-time at a local convenience store to support his studies, known by his co-workers for his quiet kindness and his infectious, shy smile. The two men exist in parallel universes until a single Craigslist advertisement bridges the gap. Luca had posted a casual encounter ad, a lure designed to attract someone who wouldn't be looking for a long-term connection, someone who might disappear into a private room without a second thought. Jun Lin, perhaps seeking companionship in a city where he was still finding his footing, responds. He has no way of knowing that he isn't walking into a date, he is walking into a trap. The late-night air is cool as Jun Lin arrives at the building. Security footage from the lobby, the last images ever captured of him alive, shows him entering the elevator at approximately 10:20 p.m. He is wearing a yellow t-shirt and a baseball cap, looking relaxed, unaware that the man who greeted him at the door had already spent hours testing the camera angles in the room upstairs. Inside apartment 208, the atmosphere is clinical and cold. Luca has removed the distractions of daily life. The bed is stripped. The recording equipment is positioned. As soon as the door clicks shut, the encounter shifts from the social to the predatory. Investigators would later determine that Jun Lin was likely drugged or restrained early in the night, rendered helpless before the true performance began. Luca Magnotta doesn't just want to kill, he wants to direct. He begins to film. The video, later titled with a sickening nod to internet gore tropes as "One Lunatic, One Ice Pick," is not a frantic, impulsive act of violence. It is a choreographed nightmare. He uses a modified tool, a screwdriver sharpened into a makeshift ice pick, to carry out the assault. Every motion is captured for the lens. He checks the frame. He adjusts the lighting. He ensures that his own face is occasionally visible, a narcissist who cannot resist being the star of his own snuff film. The music playing in the background of the apartment, and eventually on the video's soundtrack, is True Faith by New Order. The upbeat synth-pop melody provides a surreal, horrifying contrast to the silence of the act itself. The lyrics speak of a morning sun that never comes, a fitting epitaph for the darkness unfolding on Descaries Boulevard. As the hours tick past midnight, the crime escalates into a display of post-mortem desecration that defies logic. Luca spends the night dismembering Jun Lin's body. He works with a methodical, almost bored detachment, pausing to interact with the camera, to pose with the remains as if they were props in a fashion shoot. There is a terrifying lack of emotion in his movements, only the cold, calculating focus of a man who believes he is finally creating something masterful. He even involves a small dog in the footage, a callback to the animal cruelty videos that had first earned him the attention of the internet sleuths. But the production doesn't end with the final cut of the video. The script requires a distribution phase. As the sun begins to rise on May 25th, Luca begins the cleanup. He is thorough, using heavy-duty bleach to scrub the walls and the floors of apartment 208, trying to erase the physical evidence of what he has done. But he doesn't want the fact of the crime to be erased. He wants it to be felt. He packs the remains into several containers. A torso is shoved into a gray, hard-shell suitcase, the kind used by international travelers, and left in a pile of trash behind the apartment building. Then come the packages. Luca prepares 2 vibrant red envelopes, the color of celebration, of importance. Inside one, he places a severed foot. Inside the other, a severed hand. He addresses them not to random individuals, but to the pillars of the Canadian government. One is destined for the Conservative Party of Canada headquarters in Ottawa, the other for the Liberal Party. He wants the political elite to be his witnesses. He wants the entire country to be forced into his audience. He carries the packages to a local post office, moving with a calm, eerie confidence. He isn't hiding his face, he isn't scurrying in the shadows. To him, this is the press tour for his film. He drops the envelopes into the mail slot, an act that effectively turns the National Postal Service into an unwitting accomplice in his quest for infamy. Back at the apartment, he spends the rest of the day editing the footage. He adds the music, cuts the scenes for maximum shock value, and prepares to upload it to the same gore sites where he had previously posted his kitten videos. He is waiting for the reaction. He is waiting for the world to notice the suitcase in the trash and the red envelopes in the mail. The neighbor across the hall later noted a strange, cloying smell, a mixture of rotting meat and industrial-strength cleaning supplies, wafting from under the door of 208. But in a city like Montreal, where privacy is a respected currency, no one knocks. No one calls the police. Luca sits in the silence of his sterile, bleached room, staring at his computer screen. The video is live. The packages are in transit. The script is being followed to the letter. Jun Lin, a man who had come to Canada with dreams of a career in technology, is gone, his life stolen by a man who couldn't stand the thought of being ordinary. While Jun Lin's family in China begins to worry about why he hasn't answered his daily phone calls, Luca Magnotta is already looking at the clock. He has a flight to catch. He has a new role to play, the international fugitive. The apartment on Décarie Boulevard is no longer a home. It is a monument to a narcissist's ultimate achievement. Luca packs a small bag, leaving behind the Casablanca poster and the blood-soaked memories of May 24th. He walks out of the building and into the humid Montreal afternoon, heading toward the airport. He has become the monster the internet sleuths predicted he would be, and as he boards his flight to Paris, he finally feels like the star he always believed he was destined to become. The world is about to wake up to his masterpiece, and for Luca Magnotta, the applause is finally beginning. The morning of May 29, 2012, in Montreal, began with a mundane chore that would soon unravel into a national trauma. Behind the yellow brick apartment building on Décarie Boulevard, Mike Nadeau, the building's janitor, was dealing with a persistent nuisance. The trash area was overflowing, and a specific item had caught his eye for days: a cheap, gray, hard-shell suitcase. It sat atop a pile of discarded household waste, looking out of place, yet stubbornly ignored by the regular collection crews because it was too bulky. Nadeau, frustrated by the clutter, finally decided to move it himself. As he gripped the handle, he noticed the weight was off. It was heavy, dense, and shifted with a sickening thud. Then, there was the smell. It was a thick, cloying rot that even the brisk Montreal air couldn't dissipate. Curious and increasingly uneasy, he pried at the zipper. It was stuck, snagged on something caught in the teeth. When he finally forced it open, he didn't find old clothes or books. He found a human torso, wrapped in plastic but unmistakably real. The call to 911 changed the atmosphere of the neighborhood instantly. Within the hour, the alleyway was transformed from a drab service entrance into a high-stakes forensic theater. Investigators from the Service de Police de la Ville de Montréal, SPVM, cordoned off the area, their white suits standing out against the grime of the trash bins. As they processed the scene, the realization set in that this was not a localized accident. The torso was missing its head and all four limbs. The cuts were methodical, not the work of a panicked amateur, but of someone who had taken their time. While the police in Montreal were staring at a suitcase 120 miles away in Ottawa, the day was taking an even more surreal turn. At the headquarters of the Conservative Party of Canada, a staff member opened a vibrant red envelope. The contents, a severed human foot, sent the building into a state of emergency. Soon after, a second package was intercepted at a Canada Post sorting terminal, addressed to the Liberal Party. It contained a severed hand. The script Luca had written was being delivered exactly as he intended, with maximum theatricality and a total disregard for the human life he had extinguished. Back at Décarie Boulevard, the investigation moved inside. A canvass of the building led the police to apartment 208. The smell of bleach was overpowering even before they crossed the threshold. Inside, the unit appeared nearly empty, but the cleanliness was a lie. Using luminol, a chemical that reveals trace amounts of blood even after scrubbing. The detectives watched as the room lit up like a neon map of a massacre. The blood was everywhere, on the walls, on the floor, and soaked deep into the wood of the bed frame. Among the sparse remains of the tenant's life, they found a receipt for a local shipping store and a piece of paper with a return address, Luca Rocco Magnotta. As the forensic teams worked, a different kind of search was happening online. The internet sleuths, who had been shouting into the void for nearly 2 years about the cat killer, finally saw the news they had been dreading. They didn't need the police to tell them who the suspect was. They began flooding the SPVM with tips, linking the One Lunatic One Ice Pick video, which had just surfaced on a gore site, to the man they had already tracked across the digital landscape. The victim, however, remained a mystery for several more agonizing days. Jun Lin's friends had already begun to worry. He was a man of habit, a dedicated student who never missed his shifts at the convenience store. When he didn't show up for work on May 25th, his employer contacted his friends, who in turn reached out to his family in China. They posted desperate pleas on social media, hoping he had just lost his phone or was taking a quiet break. The identification process was a somber, scientific necessity. DNA from the torso in the suitcase and the extremities in the mail was matched to the profile of the missing student. On June 1st, the SPVM officially confirmed that the victim was Jun Lin. The news shattered his community. His parents, who had sacrificed everything to send their only son abroad for an education, were now faced with the impossible task of traveling to Canada to retrieve what was left of him. By the time Jun Lin was identified, the man responsible was already a ghost. The police checked flight manifests and security footage at Montreal Pierre Elliott Trudeau International Airport. They found him on the cameras from the night of May 26th, 2 full days before the torso was even discovered. Luca Magnotta had boarded Air Transat Flight TS-192 to Paris. The search had now expanded from a Montreal alleyway to an international manhunt. The Interpol Red Notice was issued, flashing Luca's face onto screens across the globe. But the disappearance of Luca Magnotta was not a simple flight from justice. It was a continuation of his performance. He wasn't hiding. He was touring. He had left behind a scene of absolute horror in Montreal, knowing that every detail he left behind, the Casablanca poster, the red envelopes, the blood-stained mattress, would be dissected by the media. The investigation into the disappearance of Jun Lin revealed the hollow cruelty of the man who took his life. While Jun Lin had spent his final days working, studying, and helping his friends, Luca had spent his days preparing for a crime that would make him famous. The disparity was staggering. The search for Jun Lin ended in a morgue, but the search for Luca Magnotta was just entering its most high-profile phase. As the Montreal police processed the thousands of images and hours of video found in apartment 208, they realized the extent of the premeditation. This wasn't a casual encounter gone wrong. Every step, from the purchase of the suitcase to the mailing of the limbs, had been a calculated move in a game Luca was playing against the world. He had vanished, but he had left the world with a souvenir of his presence that no one wanted. The disappearance was his final trick in Canada, a middle finger to the authorities who had ignored the warnings of the sleuths, and a tragic end to the promising life of a young man who had the misfortune of meeting a narcissist with a script. The search now turned toward Europe, where a man who thrived on being seen was trying to stay famous without being caught. The trail in Montreal had gone cold, but the digital breadcrumbs were still glowing, leading the way to a confrontation that Luca had been dreaming of for his entire manufactured life. While the forensic teams in Montreal were still scrubbing the residue of a nightmare from the floorboards of apartment 208, the man they were hunting was already 3,000 miles away, walking the rain-slicked streets of Paris. Luca Magnotta had not fled into the shadows. He had stepped onto a larger stage. As he landed at Charles de Gaulle Airport on May 27th, he moved with the practiced ease of a man who believed he was on a press junket rather than a flight from a murder charge. The investigation in Canada was now racing against the clock. The SPVM had officially identified the remains as those of Jun Lin, a 33-year-old student whose only mistake was responding to an ad placed by a predator. The horror of the crime was compounding. The red envelopes delivered to political offices were confirmed to contain the victim's hand and foot. But as the Interpol Red Notice began to ping on law enforcement screens across the globe, the digital trail Luca had spent years cultivating became the very thing that began to tighten the noose. In Paris, Luca checked into a low-budget hotel in the suburb of Bagnolet. He didn't stay in his room. He went to bars. He went to clubs. He was seen dining in restaurants, looking at his own reflection in windows, and even inviting a man he met at a bar back to his room. He was a narcissist who couldn't help but seek an audience, even when that audience was a potential witness for the prosecution. The breakthrough came from a combination of old-school police work and the relentless pressure of the internet. A witness at the hotel in Paris recognized Luca's face from the news and contacted the French authorities. By the time the Brigade de Recherche et d'Intervention arrived, Luca was gone, but he had left behind a scene that was becoming his calling card, a room littered with the debris of his vanity, pornographic magazines, a used air sickness bag, and the lingering clinical scent of his presence. The digital detectives, led by Deanna Thompson and John Green, were watching the news cycle with a sense of grim vindication. They had warned the world that this escalation was coming. Now, they were using their skills to analyze every scrap of information released by the European police. They weren't just looking for where he was, they were looking for where his psychology would lead him next. Luca, sensing the walls closing in on him in Paris, boarded an Eurolines bus destined for Berlin. He was a man who understood the aesthetics of the fugitive, the long bus ride, the anonymity of the highway, the crossing of borders. But in the age of constant surveillance, his stardom was being recorded at every turn. CCTV footage from the bus station showed him in a casual jacket and jeans, looking less like a cinematic villain and more like a tired, desperate man running out of options. He arrived in Berlin on June 1st, drifting into the Neukölln district, a vibrant, multicultural area where he thought he could disappear. He checked into a hostel, but his addiction to his own image was his undoing. On the afternoon of June 4th, Luca walked into an internet cafe on Karl Marx Strasse. It was a nondescript place, filled with the hum of computers and the smell of stale coffee. Kadir Anlaisli, the employee working the counter that day, noticed a man enter the shop. He looked familiar, thin, pale, with high cheekbones and a face that had been plastered over every newspaper in the city for the last 48 hours. The man sat down at a computer in the back corner and logged on. What Luca did next was the ultimate testament to his pathology. He didn't look at maps. He didn't look for ways to escape or hide his tracks. He spent over an hour reading news articles about himself. He was scouring the internet for the world's reaction to his masterpiece. He was reading about the search for Jun Lin, the suitcase in Montreal, and the red envelopes in Ottawa. He was basking in the infamy he had worked so hard to achieve. Kadir didn't hesitate. He stepped outside and flagged down a passing police van. Within minutes, 7 German police officers entered the cafe. They approached the man at the back computer. "Are you the person we are looking for?" an officer asked. Luca didn't fight. He didn't try to run. He simply sighed and looked up from the screen. "You got me," he said, his voice flat, almost relieved. The arrest of Luca Magnotta was captured by the very thing he craved most: cameras. As he was led out of the cafe in handcuffs, the news crews arrived almost instantly. The image of the Canadian psycho being taken into custody in Berlin flashed around the world within minutes. It was the climax he had scripted, the dramatic capture of the international villain. But as the police began to process him in the Berlin station, the reality of the man began to strip away the movie star persona. He was no longer the director. He was a prisoner. The investigation now shifted focus to the grueling process of extradition and the mountain of evidence that had been gathered across 2 continents. In Montreal, the janitor who found the torso and the police who walked into the blood-drenched apartment 208 were preparing for a trial that would force them to relive every horrific detail. The manhunt was over, but the investigation into the why was just beginning. The detectives were finding that Luca's life was a house of mirrors. Every fact he had ever put online was a lie. He had never dated the people he claimed to date. He had never been the successful model he pretended to be. He was a hollow man who had used the most brutal act imaginable to fill the void where a soul should have been. The world watched as the Canadian military transport plane took him from Berlin back to Montreal. It was a high-profile return, guarded by elite tactical units. Luca looked out the window of the plane, seeing the city where he had committed his masterpiece, perhaps still believing that this was all part of the film. But for the family of Jun Lin, the return of Luca Magnotta brought no closure, only the beginning of a long, painful quest for justice, in a courtroom that would soon become the site of the final act in Luca's scripted tragedy. The internet sleuths, who had started this journey with a video of two kittens, could finally step away from their screens. They had done what the system could not. They had seen the monster before he bit. As Luca sat in his cell in Montreal, awaiting trial, the spotlight he had so desperately sought was now a harsh, unforgiving glare that revealed exactly what he was: a murderer who had confused fame with infamy and a script with reality. In September 2014, the final act of Luca Magnotta's scripted tragedy moved into a Montreal courtroom. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the "one lunatic, one ice pick" video and the red envelopes sent to political offices. While the defense attempted to argue that Magnotta was not criminally responsible due to schizophrenia, a condition mirroring his father's struggles, the prosecution painted a far more calculated picture. They highlighted the years of premeditation, the systematic disposal of evidence, and the deliberate international flight as proof of a man fully aware of his actions. After 8 days of deliberation, the jury rejected the insanity plea. Luca Magnotta was found guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder and indignity to a human body. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The man who craved the world's gaze was finally cast into the permanent shadow of a maximum security cell. Luca Magnotta wanted a legacy written in blood and pixels, and in the darkest sense, he achieved it. He turned the justice system into a supporting cast and the global audience into his final witnesses. But as the cell door locked, the script finally ran out of pages. Beyond the headlines and the digital infamy lies the silent, enduring grief of Jun Lin's family, a reminder that while a narcissist plays at being a monster, the pain they leave behind is the only thing that is truly real. The spotlight has faded. The credits have rolled. Now, there is only the silence of the void he created. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. Imagine the relief. The sight of those distinctive cherries and blueberries flashing in your rearview mirror on a lonely Nova Scotia stretch. You pull over, heart steady, expecting a routine check. You see the tan uniform, the crisp stride of an RCMP officer approaching your window. But as the glass slides down, the professional nod isn't followed by a request for documents. It's followed by cold mechanical steel, and the realization that the man behind the badge is a ghost, a killer in a perfect replica, and his 13-hour harvest has only just begun. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the monster that emerged on that bloody April night, one must first look at the polished professional veneer of Gabriel Wartman, a man who spent decades meticulously crafting a reputation as a pillar of the community, all while his inner world became a pressurized chamber of resentment. Born in the late 1960s, Gabriel grew up in a household that relatives and acquaintances would later describe as deeply troubled, characterized by a complex relationship with his parents that left him with a lifelong chip on his shoulder. Those early years in New Brunswick weren't marked by poverty, but by a different kind of scarcity, a lack of emotional stability that seemed to forge a man obsessed with control and the outward appearance of success. By the time he reached adulthood, Gabriel had found his calling in the precision-driven world of denturism. He wasn't just a technician, he was a businessman who understood the value of a high-end image. He established a lucrative practice in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, where he became known for his skill and an almost obsessive attention to detail. This trait, which made him an excellent denturist, was the same dark engine that would later allow him to build a perfect instrument of death. In Dartmouth, he was the guy who could fix any smile, the professional earning hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, living a life that many would envy. He owned multiple properties, including a significant presence in the quiet coastal community of Portapique, which he treated as his personal fiefdom. However, beneath the expensive suits and the clinical precision of his office, there was a man who simmered with a volatile temper. Those who worked closely with him or knew him behind closed doors spoke of a different Gabriel, one who was litigious, prone to holding grudges for years, and possessed a disturbing fixation on the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It wasn't just a casual interest, it was a deep-seated obsession with the aesthetics of authority. He didn't want to be a police officer. He wanted the power that came with the uniform without the burden of the oath. His relationship with his longtime partner was equally fraught. To the neighbors in Portapique, they might have looked like a successful couple enjoying their seaside retreat, but the reality was a cycle of domestic tension and control. Gabriel was a man who demanded total loyalty and absolute order in his environment. When he felt that control slipping, the professional mask would crack, revealing a terrifyingly cold interior. He began collecting decommissioned police cruisers, telling friends he was simply a hobbyist who enjoyed restoring old vehicles. He even went as far as to acquire an authentic RCMP uniform, a feat of procurement that required patience and a willingness to operate in the shadows of the law. As the years rolled by, Gabriel's collection of souvenirs grew. He wasn't just restoring cars, he was building a fleet. He spent hours in his large garage in Portapique, which he called his warehouse, meticulously applying decals and light bars to a Ford Crown Victoria until it was indistinguishable from an active-duty RCMP cruiser. This wasn't a costume, it was a camouflage. He was preparing a stage for a grievance he had been nursing against the world, a world he felt hadn't given him the respect his wealth and authority deserved. The financial success he enjoyed only seemed to fuel his arrogance. He viewed himself as someone above the standard rules of society, a man who could manipulate systems and people with the same ease he manipulated the materials in his dental lab. By early 2020, as the world began to shudder under the weight of a global pandemic, Gabriel's isolation in Portapique became a breeding ground for his darkest impulses. The stressors of the lockdown, combined with long-standing disputes with family members over property and money, acted as a slow-burning fuse. He wasn't a man who broke suddenly. He was a man who had been calculating his revenge for a very long time, waiting for a moment when the world was distracted enough for him to step out of his facade and into his new, terrifying identity. In the weeks leading up to April 18th, Gabriel was observed by some as being increasingly erratic, yet his professional life remained largely undisturbed. He continued to project the image of the wealthy denturist, even as his warehouse was filled with the tools of a massacre, illegal firearms smuggled across the border, and a car that was a rolling lie. He had successfully convinced everyone around him that his eccentricities were harmless. They saw a man with a hobby, he saw a man with a plan. He had spent his life building a cage of respectability, and he was finally ready to burn it all down, taking as many people as he could with him into the ashes. This biography isn't just a record of a life, it's a map of the meticulously laid bricks that led to a 13-hour nightmare. He was a man who spent 50 years learning how to look like a human being, only to prove in one night that he was anything but. The transformation of Car 28 was his masterpiece. This was no amateur paint job or a slapdash effort for a parade. Gabriel's background as a denturist, a man whose daily bread was earned through the microscopic precision of dental molds and porcelain fittings, was funneled into the recreation of an RCMP cruiser. He utilized a high-end vinyl plotter to cut the distinctive reflective decals. He measured the spacing between the letters of RCMP and police down to the fraction of an inch, ensuring the font was indistinguishable from the real thing. He sourced a genuine light bar, the kind that casts a blinding rhythmic strobe of red and blue, and mounted it with the expertise of a professional technician. Inside the cabin, he installed a computer mount and a radio system, creating an interior environment that would make even a veteran officer feel at home. But a cruiser is only a shell without the man inside. Gabriel's search for the skin of an officer was just as relentless. He didn't just want a costume, he wanted the weight of the fabric. Over several years, he scoured online auctions and utilized murky connections to procure authentic pieces of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police kit. He acquired the high-visibility vests, the duty belts, and even the iconic red serge ceremonial tunic. By the time he was finished, he possessed a full tactical wardrobe. When he donned the uniform and sat in the driver's seat of the replica, the mirror didn't show a Dartmouth businessman. It showed a phantom officer, a man who had successfully hijacked the visual language of safety. The arsenal was the final and most lethal component of his setup. Gabriel had built a network of illegal acquisition that stretched across the border into the United States. He bypassed the stringent Canadian firearm regulations by smuggling weapons through the woods and over the lines of Maine. He favored high-capacity semi-automatic rifles and handguns. Among his collection were several Glocks and a Ruger Mini 14, weapons capable of a high volume of fire. He didn't just own them, he mastered them, stockpiling hundreds of rounds of ammunition, much of it stored in the very car he would use as a mobile hunting blind. He weighed the magazines in his hands, feeling the heavy, reassuring click of brass on steel, knowing that each round represented a life he could extinguish at his whim. As April 2020 arrived, the atmosphere in Portapique became suffocating. The global pandemic had forced a quiet, eerie stillness over the province, and the isolation seemed to act as a catalyst for Gabriel's deteriorating mental state. He was a man who thrived on the theater of his life, and with his business in Dartmouth temporarily shuttered by public health orders, the audience was gone. The only person left to witness his simmering rage was his longtime partner. The domestic tension within their home was a low-frequency hum that was beginning to scream. He was increasingly paranoid, obsessing over property boundaries and perceived slights from neighbors. He felt the world was closing in, and he responded by retreating further into his warehouse, further into the fantasy of the uniform. The setup was complete long before the first shot was fired. Gabriel had spent years building a bridge between his resentment and his reality. He had the car, the clothes, and the guns. He had practiced the gait of an officer and the cold, detached stare of a man with a badge. He had effectively created a Trojan horse of authority. To the people of Portapique, he was still the eccentric neighbor with a penchant for old cars. They saw the RCMP lettering on the side of his vehicle and assumed it was a tribute or a harmless restoration project. They didn't realize that the man in the warehouse was no longer Gabriel Wartman. He was a predator who had spent a lifetime learning how to look like a protector, and he was simply waiting for the right spark to ignite the pyre he had so carefully built. In the final days leading up to the massacre, Gabriel was observed by those few who saw him as being unusually focused, almost serene. It was the calm of a man who has finally finished a long, difficult task. The stage was set, the props were in place, and the costume was tailored to perfection. He had calculated the distances, he had mapped the roads, and he had envisioned the panic. He was no longer a denturist fixed on fixing smiles. He was an architect of a 13-hour corridor of blood. He knew that when he finally turned the key in the ignition of the replica, the world he hated would finally be forced to look him in the eye, and they would see the badge before they saw the barrel. The night of Saturday, April 18, 2020, began with a chilling, deceptive stillness in the coastal community of Portapique. This was a place where people came to disappear into the rhythm of the tides, a cluster of seasonal cottages and permanent homes tucked away in the dense evergreen shadows of the Bay of Fundy. But inside Gabriel's home, the air was thick with a familiar, toxic pressure. The argument that erupted between him and his partner wasn't a sudden explosion, it was the final grinding tectonic shift of years of control. In a fit of cold, calculated rage, Gabriel assaulted her, binding her with the very tools of his pseudo-police trade, handcuffs and ties. But as he turned his attention to the warehouse, she managed a desperate escape, vanishing into the pitch-black woods, a flight that would leave her shivering in the brush for hours, listening to the world she knew dissolve into a symphony of screams and fire. Gabriel didn't chase her. He had a different appointment. He stepped into the warehouse and began the ritual, the transformation from a man into a monument of betrayal. He donned the tan shirt, the dark trousers with the yellow stripe. He checked the fit of the tactical vest. He was no longer a resident of Portapique. He was a phantom authority. He moved through the garage, dousing his own properties with accelerant. He wanted a clean slate. He wanted the light of his own legacy to be visible from miles away. When he struck the match, the warehouse didn't just burn. It roared. The orange glow reflected off the windshield of the replica cruiser, illuminating the decals he had so carefully applied. It was the signal, the start of a 13-hour harvest. The first victims were the neighbors, people who saw the flames and did exactly what good people do in small towns. They ran toward the fire to help. Greg and Jamie Blair, living just a stone's throw away, saw the inferno consuming the Wartman property. They stepped out of their home, perhaps expecting to find Gabriel in distress. Instead, they found the replica. They saw the uniform. In those final confused seconds, they likely felt a surge of relief. The police were already here, but that relief was shattered by the staccato rhythm of gunfire. Gabriel gunned them down in cold blood, leaving their 2 young sons hiding inside the house. Children forced to navigate a nightmare where the man in the police car was the monster at the door. He didn't stop there. He moved like a shadow through the winding, unlit roads of Portapique. The sensory landscape was a hellish tapestry. The smell of salt air and pine needles now choked by the acrid, chemical stench of burning vinyl and accelerant. He drove to the home of Lisa McCulley, a beloved teacher. She, too, saw the fire. She, too, stepped outside to investigate. In the flickering light of the surrounding blazes, Gabriel ended her life with the same mechanical detachment he used to fix a set of dentures. There was no hesitation, no mercy. He was clearing the board. The confusion in the neighborhood was absolute. Residents began calling 911, reporting that their neighbor's house was on fire and that a man was shooting. But the reports were fragmented, chaotic. Some callers mentioned a police car. The dispatchers, hearing police car, likely struggled to process the contradiction. How could the police be both the emergency and the perpetrator? Gabriel used this cognitive dissonance as a tactical shield. He drove to the home of the Tuck family, Aaron, Jolene, and their daughter, Emily. They were a tight-knit unit, 3 lives extinguished in a single brutal encounter inside their own sanctuary. The silence that followed each shooting was punctuated only by the crackle of the growing fires and the distant, rhythmic beep of smoke detectors. By now, several homes were engulfed. Corey Ellison, who was visiting his father in the area, went out to see what was happening after hearing the shots. He was a man who lived to help others, a man who died because he walked toward the danger, believing the figure in the cruiser was there to protect the community. Gabriel's efficiency was terrifying. He wasn't just killing, he was hunting. He moved from property to property, setting more fires, creating a literal fog of war that blinded any incoming responders. He killed the Jolliers. He killed Peter and Joy Bond. Each time the tactic was the same: use the disguise to get close, then eliminate any witness. The first RCMP officers arriving at the scene found a landscape of pure horror. They saw the fires, orange pillars of light against the black sky, but they couldn't see their adversary. They were told a police car was involved, but as they navigated the narrow, smoke-filled lanes of Portapique, they were looking for a civilian vehicle, assuming the witness accounts were mistaken. No one wanted to believe a brother-in-arms was the source of the slaughter. Gabriel, meanwhile, was utilizing his knowledge of the local geography. He knew the back trails. He knew how to bypass the main entrance where the real police were beginning to congregate. As the clock ticked toward midnight, 13 people lay dead in the dirt and the ashes of Portapique. The community was paralyzed. Those who hadn't been targeted were huddled in their basements, lights off, clutching whatever they could for protection, watching the orange glow dance on their walls. They listened to the sounds of engines. Was it a savior or the killer? The uncertainty was a psychological torture. Gabriel had successfully turned the symbol of the RCMP, the very backbone of Canadian rural safety, into a weapon of terror. He sat in the replica, the interior bathed in the soft green glow of the dashboard lights. Outside, the world was screaming, but inside the car, It was quiet. He checked his ammunition. He checked his vest. He looked at the reflection of the fires in his rearview mirror. He wasn't done. He knew that the perimeter was closing, but he also knew a secret the police didn't. He had a way out that didn't involve the main road. He had mapped this escape long ago. The first wave ended with Portapique in ruins. 13 lives gone, a partner hiding in the woods, and a province unaware that the killer was no longer in the cordon. As the real RCMP officers moved cautiously through the smoke, clearing houses and discovering body after body, Gabriel was already miles away. Navigating the dark backroads in a car that looked exactly like theirs, he was a ghost in the machinery of the law, and the morning sun was about to reveal just how far his corridor of blood would stretch. The fires in Portapique were just the pilot light for the horror he had planned for the rest of Nova Scotia. As the first gray light of Sunday, April 19th, began to bleed over the horizon, the temperature hovered at a biting 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The fires in Portapique were still smoldering, casting long, skeletal shadows across the devastation, but the man responsible was no longer there. While the RCMP were methodically clearing the charred remains of the coastal community, Gabriel Wartman was approximately 25 miles away, navigating the backroads with a predator's focus. He had spent the night in the shadows, perhaps watching the glow of his own destruction from a distance, before slipping through the net that was supposed to be tightening around him. He wasn't just driving, he was patrolling a corridor of blood that he had spent years mapping out in his mind. By 8 a.m., the nightmare shifted to the quiet community of Wentworth. Gabriel drove the replica cruiser with a casual, practiced ease that projected an aura of absolute legitimacy. He pulled into the driveway of Alana Jenkins and Sean McLeod, acquaintances he had known for years. They were correctional officers, people who understood the weight of a uniform, people who likely felt a surge of professional relief when they saw the Crown Victoria idling in front of their home. But that relief was a death sentence. Gabriel entered their sanctuary and murdered them both with the same clinical, mechanical coldness he had displayed in Portapique. To erase the evidence of his presence and to add to the growing tally of chaos, he set their home ablaze. The smoke from their lives rose into the morning air, a second pillar of fire that signaled the killer had moved, though the authorities were still minutes away from realizing the scale of his mobility. A neighbor, Tom Bagley, saw the smoke and did what any brave soul in rural Nova Scotia would do. He stepped out of his home to offer help, perhaps expecting to find a brother in arms at the scene of an accident. Instead, he found the ghost. Gabriel gunned him down in the road, leaving his body in the cold morning light. The killer then returned to the replica, the 4.6-liter V8 engine growling as he accelerated back onto the highway. He was moving with a terrifying efficiency, utilizing the highway system to cover vast distances while the RCMP were still trying to verify his identity. The psychological horror of this phase of the massacre cannot be overstated. Gabriel was no longer a hidden sniper in the woods. He was a visible symbol of safety moving through public spaces. He was the thin blue line personified, and every person he passed on the road saw him as a protector. He drove past dozens of motorists who likely nodded in respect to the officer on the move. Around 9 a.m., he encountered Lillian Campbell, a woman simply out for a morning walk with her dog in the community of Wentworth Valley. She was an innocent bystander, a stranger to the gunman. He pulled over, perhaps projecting the image of a helpful officer checking on a citizen before ending her life on the shoulder of the road. There was no motive beyond the opportunity to kill, no logic beyond the expansion of his own dark legend. The information gap during these hours was a canyon that the killer exploited. While the RCMP were utilizing Twitter to warn the public about a vicious suspect in a replica police car, many in the rural communities were not checking social media. There was no provincial emergency alert, no blaring siren on mobile phones, no interruption of radio broadcasts. People were going about their Sunday mornings, making breakfast, and planning their day, completely unaware that a phantom cruiser was hunting in their midst. Gabriel traveled south, moving toward the community of Debert. He was a mobile hunting blind, his laptop mount and radio system flickering with the illusion of official business. In Debert, the tragedy took on a particularly heart-wrenching dimension. He encountered two women, both nurses, who were heading to work to care for others in the middle of a global pandemic. Heather O'Brien, a veteran nurse and grandmother, was driving her vehicle when she was intercepted. Gabriel utilized the replica's lights, those red and blue strobes that are hardwired into our brains as a command to stop, to pull her over. He murdered her in her car, leaving her family to later find her vehicle on the side of the road, a sight of unimaginable grief. Minutes later, he encountered Kristen Beaton. She was a continuing care assistant, a young mother who was pregnant with her second child. She had pulled over to the side of the road, perhaps to check her phone or to catch her breath between shifts. She saw the cruiser approach. She saw the man in the uniform. In those final seconds, she likely felt safe, believing that the police were there to guide her through whatever chaos was unfolding. Gabriel gunned her down through the glass, a double murder that snuffed out a young life and the promise of another. The sheer cowardice of the act, using the tools of a protector to execute a pregnant woman in cold blood, is the defining stain on this 13-hour corridor. The interior of the replica must have been a sanctuary of madness. The smell of cold morning air, the metallic tang of the firearms resting on the passenger seat, and the rhythmic sound of the tires on the asphalt. Gabriel was operating within a vacuum of his own making. He had successfully paralyzed the system by becoming a part of it. Every time a real officer saw a white Ford Crown Victoria in the distance, they had to hesitate. Was it a colleague? Was it a supervisor? That half-second of doubt was all Gabriel needed to maintain his momentum. He continued his journey, the morning sun now fully illuminating the RCMP decals on the side of his car. He was traveling at high speeds, weaving through the geography of the province with a hunter's instinct. He was no longer just a man with a grievance. He was a glitch in the reality of the province. He had turned the very concept of the police into a weapon against the people who paid for their protection. As he moved closer to the heart of the province, the real RCMP were beginning to close in, but the carnage he had already wrought on the highways of Wentworth and Debert had left a trail of bodies and shattered families that would take decades to heal. The morning rampage was a demonstration of the ultimate betrayal, the moment when the shepherd becomes the wolf, wearing the shepherd's clothes, and the flock has nowhere left to run. The RCMP response was a chaotic blend of high-speed pursuits and agonizing uncertainty. Officers were flooding the highways, their sirens wailing, but they were operating with a massive information deficit. The suspect, Gabriel Wartman, was utilizing his knowledge of the local landscape to move like a ghost between the primary arteries of the province. He wasn't just fleeing, he was navigating. He had successfully bypassed several police checkpoints simply by slowing down, nodding to the sentries, and being waved through, the ultimate irony of a man wearing a costume of authority to evade the authority itself. The officers on the line were looking for a vicious suspect, but their eyes were trained to see the uniform as a friend, not a foe. This cognitive dissonance allowed Gabriel to remain mobile for far longer than any civilian vehicle ever could have. The tension reached a breaking point in the community of Shubenacadie. This was where the blue-on-blue reality of the massacre became a physical, bloody confrontation. Constable Heidi Stevenson, a 23-year veteran of the force and a mother of two, was on patrol, actively searching for the replica. She was a respected officer who embodied the very best of the RCMP, the exact opposite of the hollow, murderous mimic she was about to face. Around 10:50 a.m., their paths crossed. In a desperate, brave attempt to stop the killer, Stevenson used her patrol car to ram the replica. The impact was a violent collision of steel and glass, a physical rejection of the lie Gabriel had built. The aftermath of the crash was a hellish scene. Both vehicles were heavily damaged, steam hissing from their radiators into the cold air. Witnesses saw the man in the uniform exit the replica. He didn't check on the officer he had just hit. He engaged her in a struggle for her life. Gabriel, fueled by a coward's rage and a predator's desperation, gunned down Constable Stevenson. But his betrayal didn't end with her death. He didn't just kill a police officer. He pillaged her. He took her sidearm and her ammunition, effectively upgrading his arsenal with the very tools meant to stop him. He then set both his damaged replica and Stevenson's cruiser on fire, the black smoke rising like a funeral pyre for the badge he had spent years imitating. While the fires consumed the evidence of the collision, Gabriel turned his attention to another innocent bystander who had stopped to help. Joey Weber, a young father out to get furnace oil for his family, saw the crash and the officer in distress. He pulled over, offering his vehicle to a man he believed was a hero in trouble. Gabriel killed him instantly, took his silver SUV, and continued his flight. The predator had changed his skin. He was no longer in the replica, but he was still wearing the uniform, a fact that kept the police in a state of constant, panicked recalibration. The hunt was now a frantic race across the Shubenacadie and Enfield corridor. The RCMP were desperate to close the distance, but the fog of war was thick. In one of the most controversial moments of the response, 2 officers from a specialized unit arrived at the Onslow Belmont Fire Brigade Hall. They saw a man in a yellow striped vest standing next to an RCMP cruiser. Believing they had found the killer, they opened fire. They sprayed the fire hall with bullets, the rounds shattering the windows and sending people inside, diving for cover. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated terror, a blue-on-blue incident that highlighted the total breakdown of situational awareness. The man they were shooting at was actually a fellow emergency responder, and the cruiser belonged to a real officer who had stepped inside. The killer was nowhere near the building. He was miles away, still moving south. The realization that they had fired upon their own was a crushing blow to the morale of the responding units. The system was eating itself. Gabriel had succeeded in making the police fear their own shadows. Every officer on the road was now a potential target, not just for the killer, but for their own colleagues. The radio chatter was a symphony of confusion, with reports of sightings coming in from all directions. The sheer scale of the massacre, the bodies left in Wentworth, Debert, and Shubenacadie, was beginning to weigh on the collective psyche of the province. Gabriel's final movement took him toward a home in the Glenholm area. He knew the residents, Gina Goulet, a denturist like himself and a skilled woodcarver. He invaded her home, ending her life in a final act of professional and personal resentment. He took her vehicle, a Mazda 3, and ditched the SUV. He was constantly shedding his identity, a chameleon of carnage. He was now driving a civilian car, but still wearing the blood-stained RCMP trousers and vest. He was heading for the airport, perhaps looking for a final, spectacular exit, or perhaps just looking for a place to die. The hunt was entering its final minutes. The RCMP had finally established a solid lead, tracking the movements of the stolen vehicles. They were converging on the Enfield area, a major transit hub north of Halifax. The air was thick with the sound of helicopters and the roar of high-performance police engines. The officers were no longer just responding. They were hunting with a vengeance. They had lost one of their own, and the embarrassment of the replica car had turned into a burning need for justice. The 13-hour corridor of blood was narrowing. The ghost in the cruiser was running out of road, and the final confrontation was about to occur at a place as mundane as a gas station, a sharp, violent end to a tragedy that had started in the fires of Portapique and ended in the bright, unforgiving light of a Sunday morning. The psychological toll on the officers involved in this hunt would last for years. They had been forced to look into a mirror and see a murderer. They had been forced to question the very symbols they held dear. Gabriel Wartman hadn't just killed 22 people. He had attempted to kill the trust between the public and the police. As the real cruisers screamed toward Enfield, the officers inside were carrying the weight of a province that had seen its safety shattered by a man who spent his life fixing smiles, only to leave a trail of broken lives that no surgery could ever repair. The blue-on-blue hunt was the final desperate struggle of a system trying to purge a poison that had looked exactly like the cure. The end did not come with a cinematic flourish, but with a chance encounter at a gas pump in Enfield. Around 11:26 a.m., an RCMP officer, already on high alert, stopped at the Irving Big Stop to refuel. As he looked across the lot, he spotted a man in a gray Mazda 3 who looked remarkably like the suspect. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and the distant, fading wails of sirens. Gabriel Wartman was sitting in the driver's seat, still wearing the blood-stained remnants of his stolen authority. There were no words exchanged, no formal commands to surrender. The officer, recognizing the threat, drew his sidearm. In a sudden, violent burst of gunfire, the 13-hour reign of terror was neutralized. Gabriel was killed at the scene, slumped over the steering wheel of a stolen car, surrounded by the mundane architecture of a highway pit stop. The ghost in the cruiser was finally grounded, his corridor of blood ending at a pump, just miles from the city he had once called home. The sirens have long since faded, but the silence left in their wake is heavy with the names of the 22 lives stolen in a single waking nightmare. Nova Scotia remains a province forever altered, a place where the sight of a cruiser in the rearview mirror can still trigger a phantom shiver of doubt. Gabriel Wartman's legacy isn't the uniform he coveted or the replica he built. It is the enduring grief of families who must navigate a world without their protectors, their healers, and their friends. The denturist who spent a lifetime crafting smiles left behind a scar that no amount of time can fully heal. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous ghost is the one wearing the mask of a hero. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.